On the morning of June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip stood on a street corner in Sarajevo, a loaded pistol tucked beneath his coat, and waited for a motorcade that was running late. He had already given up. The first assassination attempt that morning had failed. A bomb had bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded beneath the vehicle behind it, injuring 20 people but leaving the intended target untouched. The other conspirators had scattered. The plot, it seemed, was over. And then the Archduke's driver made a wrong turn. The car slowed to a stop barely 5 feet from where Princip was standing, having wandered there almost by accident, perhaps to buy a sandwich, perhaps simply to disappear into a crowd. He looked up. There, sitting in the open-topped car, close enough to touch, was Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria Est, heir to the Habsburg throne, wearing a pale blue tunic heavy with medals, his wife Sophie beside him in a white dress and a wide-brimmed hat. Princip raised the pistol, stepped forward, and fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second pierced Franz Ferdinand's jugular vein. As his wife slumped against him, the Archduke was heard to murmur over and over the same desperate phrase, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." They were both dead within the hour. What followed from those 2 gunshots would consume the world. Within 5 weeks, the great powers of Europe would be at war. Within 4 years, 20 million people would be dead. And by November of 1918, under the dynasty that Franz Ferdinand had been born to lead, a dynasty that had shaped European history for more than 600 years, that had ruled over more territory and more peoples than any family the continent had ever known, would simply cease to exist. The House of Habsburg did not fall in a single dramatic blow. It dissolved like sugar in water, slowly and then all at once. And perhaps that was fitting, because the Habsburgs had not risen through a single dramatic blow either. They had not stormed onto the stage of European history with fire and steel, the way the Normans took England or the Mongols swept across Asia. Their ascent was something stranger, something quieter, and in many ways something far more remarkable. They married their way to the top. This is the story of how a minor Swiss noble family, perched in a small stone fortress above the Ahr River, became the most powerful dynasty in European history. It is a story of patience, strategic cunning, fortunate deaths, and an almost supernatural talent for being in the right place at the right time. It stretches across 7 centuries, from the alpine mists of medieval Switzerland to the gilded ballrooms of Vienna, from the silver mines of Peru to the battlefields of the First World War. The primary sources for the early Habsburg period are fragmentary but revealing. The Acta Murensia, a chronicle compiled by monks at the Muri Abbey in what is now the Swiss canton of Aargau, provides the earliest genealogical records of the family, tracing their lineage back to the early 11th century. For the later medieval period, we are indebted to the meticulous records of the Holy Roman Empire's chanceries, to the chronicles of Matthias of Neuenburg and Jan of Vichtring, and to the letters and charters preserved in the Haus-, Hof- und Staatsarchive in Vienna, one of the great documentary repositories of European civilization. These records, many of them written by scribes who served the Habsburgs directly, allow us to track with unusual precision the family's transformation from regional lords to continental rulers. They also reveal something the Habsburgs themselves would have preferred to keep hidden, that their rise was neither inevitable nor preordained, but the product of relentless opportunism dressed in the clothing of divine right. To understand the Habsburgs, you must first understand the world that made them. And that means starting not in a palace or on a battlefield, but in a place far humbler and far more revealing. In the northeastern corner of what is now Switzerland, where the Ahr River bends through a landscape of rolling green hills and dark pine forests, there stands a modest ruin on a rocky promontory. The walls are low. The tower is squat. Wildflowers grow between the stones. A tourist visiting today might walk past it without a second glance, mistaking it for a medieval farmstead or the remnant of some forgotten watchtower. There is nothing about it that whispers of empire, and yet this is Habsburg Castle. The Habsburg, the Hawk's Castle, built around the year 1020 by a nobleman named Radbot, Count of Klettgau, and his bishop brother Werner. The fortress was modest even by the standards of 11th century Switzerland. It commanded a view of the Ahr Valley and the approaches to several important trade routes, but it was no Camelot. It was a practical fortification in a practical landscape designed to protect a family whose ambitions at that point extended no further than the local region. The name itself tells you something. Habsburg, Hawk's Castle, suggests a family that identified with a predator known not for its raw power like a lion or a bear, but for its patience, its watchfulness, its ability to sit motionless on a high perch and wait for precisely the right moment to strike. Whether the name was chosen deliberately or assigned by later generations who wanted to retroactively poeticize their origins, the metaphor proved prophetic. The Switzerland of the early 11th century was not yet the Switzerland we know. It was part of the Duchy of Swabia, itself a constituent region of the Holy Roman Empire. That sprawling, decentralized, and perpetually contentious patchwork of German-speaking territories that would dominate Central European politics for the better part of a millennium. The Holy Roman Empire was, in theory, the successor to the Roman Empire in the West, its emperor crowned by the Pope, its authority theoretically stretching from the North Sea to the Alps. In practice, it was a constellation of semi-independent duchies, counties, bishoprics, and free cities, each jealously guarding its own privileges, each jockeying for advantage, each watching the emperor with a mixture of deference and suspicion. It was, in other words, the perfect environment for a patient family. The early Habsburgs were not kings. They were not even particularly powerful counts. They controlled a modest territory in the Aargau region and a scattering of rights and properties across Upper Alsace and parts of southwestern Germany. Their world was measured in river crossings and market towns, in the number of armed knights they could summon and the tolls they could collect from merchants passing through their lands. They attended to local disputes, maintained their castle, cultivated relationships with neighboring lords, and, crucially, with the church. The Muri Abbey, founded by Radbot and his wife Ida around 1027, served as both a spiritual center and a political instrument, a way of projecting piety, accumulating divine favor, and anchoring the family's identity in a landscape where names and borders shifted with every generation. For nearly 200 years, the Habsburgs played this quiet game. They accumulated. A marriage here brought new lands. A strategic alliance there secured a valuable patronage. A well-timed act of loyalty to the right duke or bishop earned privileges that could be passed to the next generation. They were not the most powerful family in Swabia. They were not the most famous, but they were persistent. And in a world where dynasties rose and fell with the lifespan of a single ambitious lord, persistence was its own form of genius. The landscape itself shaped the family's character. The foothills of the Swiss Alps are not a place that rewards recklessness. The winters are long. The valleys are narrow. The distances between settlements feel longer than they are, stretched by difficult terrain and unpredictable weather. A family that thrived here learned to think in seasons, not in days, to plant alliances that might not bear fruit for a generation, to consolidate quietly rather than expand dramatically. The Habsburgs absorbed these lessons into their blood, but patience, however virtuously practiced, does not build empires. Patience creates the conditions for opportunity. And in the year 1273, after 2 centuries of quiet accumulation, opportunity arrived in a form that no one, least of all the other princes of the Holy Roman Empire, expected. To understand what happened, you need to understand the crisis that preceded it. For nearly 20 years, the Holy Roman Empire had been convulsed by a period of chaos known as the Great Interregnum. The previous line of emperors, the Hohenstaufen dynasty, had been destroyed in a catastrophic conflict with the papacy. The last Hohenstaufen emperor, Frederick II, had died in 1250. His heirs had been hunted down and killed. His grandson Conradin, barely 16 years old, was publicly beheaded in the market square of Naples in 1268, the last of his line, executed on the orders of Charles of Anjou while a crowd watched in silence. With the Hohenstaufen gone, the empire was a throne without a king. Various foreign princes claimed the title, Richard of Cornwall, Alfonso X of Castile, but none could enforce their authority within the German-speaking lands. The great princes of the empire governed their own territories as they pleased. Robber barons terrorized the roads. Commerce suffered. The church fretted. It was a period of drift and disorder, a vacuum that someone would eventually have to fill. The question was who? The answer, when it came, surprised everyone. In 1273, the 7 prince-electors of the Holy Roman Empire, the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia, gathered to choose a new king. They had compelling reasons to avoid choosing anyone too powerful. The memory of the Hohenstaufen was fresh. A strong emperor might threaten their own independence. What they needed was someone respectable but manageable. Someone with enough land to maintain the dignity of the office but not enough to dominate the empire. Someone who would owe them a debt of gratitude so large that he could never fully repay it. They chose Rudolf of Habsburg. He was 55 years old. Tall, with a long nose that would become a family characteristic, and a lean, angular frame that contemporaries noted made him look perpetually hungry. He was by all accounts intelligent, pragmatic, and deeply pious. Though his piety, like most medieval piety, was thoroughly compatible with political ambition. He controlled a respectable territory in southwestern Germany and Switzerland. He was well connected through marriage. His first wife, Gertrude of Hohenberg, had brought him valuable Swabian lands, and he had married several of his daughters to influential German nobles. But he was not, by any reasonable measure, a great lord. The Habsburgs were still a regional family. When word spread that Rudolf had been elected King of the Romans, the title that preceded formal coronation as Holy Roman Emperor, the reaction among Europe's established powers ranged from bemusement to contempt. Ottokar II, the powerful King of Bohemia, who had expected to dominate the election, refused to recognize Rudolf's authority. He dismissed the new king as a minor count who had risen above his station. It was a miscalculation that would cost Ottokar everything. Rudolf proved to be something his electors had not bargained for. A man of genuine political ability masked by an appearance of modesty. He moved carefully at first, securing alliances, confirming privileges, demonstrating to the German princes that he intended to govern rather than dictate. He was unfailingly courteous. He listened more than he spoke. He dressed simply, ate modestly, and traveled constantly through his kingdom, making himself visible and accessible in a way that previous emperors had not. But beneath the modest exterior, Rudolf was conducting a cold and precise calculation. The Habsburg lands in Switzerland and Alsace were too scattered, too vulnerable, and too far from the empire's political center to serve as a lasting power base. If the Habsburgs were to become more than a single generation's anomaly, if they were to survive as a dynasty, they needed something bigger, something more strategically positioned, something that would anchor them to the center of European power for generations to come. Rudolf found what he was looking for in the East. The Duchy of Austria had been ruled by the Babenberg dynasty for nearly 3 centuries before the family died out in 1246. Since then, it had been claimed by Ottokar II of Bohemia, who had married a Babenberg heiress and incorporated Austria, along with Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, into his growing Bohemian empire. Ottokar's realm stretched from the Bohemian forests to the Adriatic Sea. He was one of the most powerful rulers in Central Europe, and he had just publicly insulted the new king. Rudolf spent 3 years building a coalition against him. He won over the Hungarian king, recruited disaffected Austrian nobles who chafed under Bohemian rule, and secured the support of key German princes. Then, in 1278, on the Marchfeld, a flat, featureless plain northeast of Vienna, with the kind of landscape where cavalry could charge unimpeded, the two armies met. The Battle of the Marchfeld, fought on August 26, 1278, was the decisive moment of Rudolph's reign and the foundational act of Habsburg power. It was a brutal, grinding engagement. Ottokar's army was larger and included some of the finest heavy cavalry in Central Europe. Rudolph's forces were a coalition, Austrians, Hungarians, and Germans, held together by shared antagonism toward the Bohemian king rather than by any deep loyalty to the Habsburg cause. The battle swayed back and forth for hours. The August sun beat down on armored men and horses churning through dust and blood. At one point, Rudolph himself was unhorsed and nearly killed, a moment that would have ended the Habsburg story before it truly began. But the Hungarians on his flanks held firm, and their light cavalry eventually encircled Ottokar's forces. The Bohemian king fought on, refusing to surrender, until he was dragged from his horse and killed, some sources say murdered, after he had already been taken prisoner, stabbed repeatedly by Austrian nobles who had personal scores to settle. Ottokar's body was displayed publicly, his empire was dismembered, and Rudolph of Habsburg, the minor count whom no one had taken seriously, claimed Austria, Styria, and the surrounding duchies as his own. He did not keep them for himself. In 1282, Rudolph invested his two sons, Albert and Rudolph II, with the Duchy of Austria and the Duchy of Styria. It was a dynastic act of profound significance. By granting these territories to his heirs rather than simply holding them as king, Rudolph was transforming Austria from a conquered territory into a Habsburg patrimony, a family possession that would be inherited by successive generations regardless of whether any future Habsburg held the imperial title. The other German princes watched this maneuver with varying degrees of alarm. Some protested. Rudolph mollified them with concessions and confirmations of their own privileges. He was always careful, always measured. He never took more than he could hold. He never provoked a fight he could not win. And when he died in 1291 at the age of 73 in an extraordinary lifespan for a medieval ruler, he left his family something they had never had before, a power base at the heart of Europe. The Austria that Rudolph bequeathed to his sons was not yet the Austria of Mozart and Freud and the Ringstrasse. In Vienna in the late 13th century was a growing but still modest city on the Danube, surrounded by walls that enclosed a dense web of narrow streets, timber-framed houses, and stone churches. The great Gothic Cathedral of St. Stephen's was still decades from completion. The Hofburg Palace was a fortified residence, not the Baroque labyrinth it would later become. The countryside beyond the walls was fertile but heavily forested, the river prone to flooding, the winters sharp and relentless, but the location was everything. Austria sat at the crossroads of Europe's major trade routes. The Danube provided a highway from Germany to the Black Sea, while overland routes connected Italy to the north. Whoever controlled Vienna controlled the flow of goods, people, and information across the continent's central corridor. The Babenbergs had understood this. The Habsburgs understood it better. And yet the century that followed Rudolph's death was anything but a smooth ascent. The Habsburgs stumbled. They fought among themselves. They lost the imperial title almost immediately. Rudolph's son, Albert I, won it back briefly, only to be assassinated by his own nephew in 1308. For the next century and a half, the imperial crown passed to other families, the Luxembourgs, the Wittelsbachs, while the Habsburgs retreated to their Austrian lands and consolidated. This period is often overlooked in popular accounts of the dynasty, which tend to leap from Rudolph's conquest of Austria to the family's later imperial glory, as though the intervening 150 years were merely a boring interlude. In fact, this was the period when the Habsburgs learned the lessons that would define them for the next 5 centuries. They learned first that the imperial title was a trap as much as a prize. The Holy Roman Emperor had vast theoretical authority but limited practical power. The princes who elected him expected favors. The Pope expected obedience, or at least deference. The Italian city-states expected to be left alone. Governing the empire meant managing an endless web of competing interests, And the cost of failure was not just political defeat, but dynastic extinction, as the Hohenstaufen had discovered. They learned, second, that territorial consolidation was more valuable than territorial expansion. During the 14th century, the Austrian Habsburgs focused relentlessly on rounding out their lands, acquiring Carinthia in 1335, Tyrol in 1363, incorporating smaller lordships and counties through purchase, marriage, and judicious application of legal claims. They built not outward but inward, filling gaps, connecting territories, creating a coherent block of land in the Eastern Alps that could be defended and administered as a unit. And they learned, third, the lesson that would become their defining principle, that marriage was cheaper than war. The phrase that later generations attributed to them, Bella gerent alii tu felix Austria nube, let others wage war, you happy Austria marry, was probably coined by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus in the late 15th century, as a rueful acknowledgement that the Habsburgs kept acquiring through the marriage bed what he could only take through the battlefield. But the strategy was already visible in the 14th century. Every Habsburg marriage was a political calculation. Every bride and groom represented not just a union of persons, but a union of territories, claims, and alliances. It was a strategy that required something most medieval rulers lacked, the ability to think in generations rather than lifetimes. A marriage arranged today might not produce territorial gains for 50 years, until the other family's line died out and the Habsburg claim, dormant but legally valid, could finally be activated. This meant accepting uncertainty. It meant playing a game whose outcome you would never see. It meant trusting that your descendants would be as shrewd, as patient, and as fertile as you were. The Habsburgs trusted, and history rewarded them. The man who transformed the Habsburgs from a powerful Austrian dynasty into a European superpower was born in 1459, in a world that was beginning to change faster than anyone could comprehend. Frederick III had been Holy Roman Emperor for decades, a cautious, plodding ruler whose enemies mocked him as the arch-sleepyhead of the Holy Roman Empire. But Frederick understood something his critics did not. He understood that in the long game of dynastic politics, outliving your rivals was itself a form of victory. He survived, he endured, and he arranged a marriage. In 1477, Frederick's son Maximilian married Mary of Burgundy. It was the marriage that changed European history. Mary was the sole heiress of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who had been killed at the Battle of Nancy in January 1477. Charles had ruled over the richest territories in Europe, the Low Countries, including what is now Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, along with the Duchy of Burgundy itself and the Free County of Burgundy in eastern France. These lands contained the most productive cities on the continent: Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, Brussels. These were centers of banking, textile production, and international trade that generated more wealth than most kingdoms. Charles had died without a male heir. His daughter Mary, just 20 years old, was suddenly the most sought-after bride in Europe. The French king, Louis XI, immediately invaded, seizing the Duchy of Burgundy and attempting to force Mary into a marriage with his own son. Mary, desperate for protection, turned to the Habsburgs. Maximilian arrived in the Low Countries like a figure from a romance, young, handsome, athletic, and utterly charming. He and Mary were married in August 1477, and by all accounts it was a genuine love match, not merely a political arrangement. They had 2 children before Mary died in a riding accident in 1482, thrown from her horse while hawking. She was 25 years old. Her death was a personal tragedy for Maximilian. But dynastically, the marriage had already accomplished what it needed to accomplish. Their son, Philip the Handsome, inherited the Burgundian territories. The Habsburgs had leapt in a single generation from a landlocked Alpine duchy to the shores of the North Sea. They now controlled the economic engine of Northern Europe. Maximilian himself would go on to become one of the most consequential Habsburgs in history, not because of any single achievement, but because of his extraordinary talent for dynastic engineering. He married his son Philip to Joanna of Castile, Daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, he married his granddaughter Mary to Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia and arranged for his grandson Ferdinand to marry Louis's sister Anna. Each of these marriages was a seed planted in the soil of the future, and each would bear fruit that Maximilian himself would not live to see. Philip and Joanna's son would inherit Spain and its growing American empire. Ferdinand and Anna's marriage would eventually give the Habsburgs the crowns of Hungary and Bohemia. Maximilian was building a dynasty that would dominate Europe for centuries. And he was doing it not with armies, but with wedding rings. He died in 1519 at the age of 59, having spent his final years obsessed with his own legacy, commissioning elaborate genealogies that traced the Habsburg line back to Troy and ancient Rome, ordering massive woodcuts that depicted him as a conquering hero, and writing an allegorical autobiography that recast his life as a chivalric romance. He was vain. He was extravagant. He was perpetually short of money. But he understood with a clarity that few rulers before or since have matched, that in the game of European power, the wedding chapel was more decisive than the battlefield, and the proof of his genius would arrive in the person of his grandson. When Charles of Ghent was born on February 24, 1500, in the Prinsenhof Palace in the Flemish city of Ghent, his inheritance was already being assembled by forces beyond any single person's control. His father Philip had died in 1506. His mother Joanna, consumed by grief and possibly by mental illness, had been declared unfit to rule and confined to a palace in Tordesillas, Spain, where she would remain for the next 46 years. Charles inherited everything. From his father's side, through Maximilian, he received the Habsburg lands in Austria and the imperial title. From his mother's side, through Ferdinand and Isabella, he received the crowns of Castile and Aragon, which together comprised Spain, along with the Spanish territories in southern Italy, Sardinia, Sicily, and the rapidly expanding colonies in the Americas. From his grandmother Mary of Burgundy, he received the Low Countries and the Free County of Burgundy. From various other Habsburg marriages and inheritances, he received claims to territories stretching from the Danube to the Strait of Gibraltar. He was 19 years old when he was elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, and his realm was the largest any European ruler had governed since Charlemagne. It was said, and the phrase would become famous, that the sun never set on his empire. This was literally true. When the sun was setting on his Spanish territories in the western Mediterranean, it was rising on his possessions in the Philippines named after his son Philip. When night fell on the Low Countries, daylight still illuminated his American colonies. In the young man with the jutting Habsburg jaw, already showing the pronounced underbite that would become the dynasty's most recognizable physical feature, ruled more of the earth's surface than any monarch in history. And it was here, at this breathtaking apex of Habsburg power, that the problems began. Because an empire so vast was also an empire impossible to govern, Charles's domains had no common language, no common law, no common culture, and no common interest. What mattered to a Flemish merchant in Antwerp had nothing to do with what mattered to a Castilian grandee in Toledo, and neither cared about the concerns of an Austrian mine operator in Tyrol. The empire's enemies, France to the west, the Ottoman Empire to the east, and Protestant reformers within, could attack at any point along a frontier that stretched thousands of miles. Charles spent his reign in perpetual motion, traveling from one crisis to the next, never able to resolve one problem before another erupted somewhere else. And now, from the east and from within, two forces were converging that would reshape the Habsburg story entirely. The first was the Ottoman Empire under its greatest sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, whose armies had already conquered Belgrade and were pressing toward the heart of Europe. The second was a German monk named Martin Luther, whose challenge to the Catholic Church was tearing the fabric of Christendom apart and dividing Charles's own subjects against each other. The quiet dynasty was about to enter its loudest century. The Ottoman threat arrived not as a distant rumor, but as an earthquake felt in the bones of every Christian kingdom east of the Rhine. Suleiman the Magnificent had ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1520, 1 year after Charles became Holy Roman Emperor, and from the very beginning he made his ambitions clear. Belgrade fell in 1521. The island fortress of Rhodes, held by the Knights Hospitaller for over 2 centuries, surrendered in 1522. The Ottoman navy dominated the eastern Mediterranean, and in 1526 Suleiman turned his attention to Hungary, the last significant buffer between the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg heartlands. The Kingdom of Hungary in the early 16th century was a realm in crisis. Its young king, Louis II, was barely 20 years old, politically inexperienced, and chronically short of funds. The Hungarian nobility, fractious and jealous of their privileges, had spent decades undermining royal authority. The kingdom's once formidable military had been allowed to deteriorate. And now, in the summer of 1526, an Ottoman army of perhaps 100,000 men was marching north through the Balkans, headed straight for the Hungarian plain. Louis called his banners. The response was catastrophically inadequate. Fewer than 25,000 men assembled at the town of Mohacs, on the west bank of the Danube in southern Hungary. Many of the great Hungarian lords had not yet arrived with their contingents. Some were still marching. Others were deliberately hanging back, calculating that whoever won the battle, they would need to negotiate with the victor. Louis could not afford to wait. The Ottoman army was approaching, and every day of delay allowed Suleiman to choose his ground. On August 29, 1526, the two armies met on the plain of Mohacs. The battle lasted approximately 90 minutes. The Hungarian heavy cavalry, still fighting in the medieval style, armored knights charging in dense formations, smashed into the Ottoman center with terrifying force. For a brief, glorious moment, the charge seemed to succeed. The Ottoman front lines buckled. Hungarian horsemen pushed deep into the enemy formation, and then the Ottoman artillery opened fire. The Hungarians had no answer for the guns. Suleiman had positioned his cannons behind chained wagons in the center of his line, and as the Hungarian cavalry became entangled in the Ottoman infantry, the guns tore them apart at close range. The flanks collapsed. The retreat became a rout. The thousands of Hungarian soldiers, weighed down by their armor, drowned in the marshy ground behind their own lines, trampled by their fleeing comrades, or sucked into waterlogged fields from which they could not extract themselves. King Louis II was among the dead. His horse stumbled crossing a swollen stream during the retreat, and the young king, trapped beneath his armor, drowned in barely 5 feet of water. His body was not found for weeks. With Louis dead, the crown of Hungary was vacant. And this was the moment when Maximilian's patient matrimonial engineering paid its dividend. Louis had been married to Mary of Habsburg, granddaughter of Maximilian. His sister Anna had been married to Ferdinand of Habsburg, Charles V's younger brother. The marriage contracts had specified that if Louis died without an heir, the Hungarian and Bohemian crowns would pass to the Habsburgs. Ferdinand claimed both crowns immediately. The Bohemian nobles accepted him with minimal resistance. The Hungarian situation was far more complicated. A significant faction of Hungarian nobles, unwilling to submit to Habsburg rule, elected their own king, János Szapolyai, a powerful Transylvanian lord who had conspicuously failed to arrive at Mohacs in time for the battle. Hungary was split. Ferdinand controlled the western strip, including the old capital of Pressburg. Szapolyai held Transylvania and the eastern territories, and Suleiman, having demonstrated that he could destroy any army the Hungarians put in the field, occupied the central plain, including the city of Buda itself. This tripartite division of Hungary would persist in various forms for the next century and a half. It created a permanent war zone at the Habsburg Empire's eastern frontier, a bleeding wound that drained resources, demanded constant military attention, and shaped Habsburg policy for generations. The Habsburgs could not abandon Hungary without exposing Austria itself to Ottoman invasion. They could not conquer Hungary without defeating the Ottomans, which was beyond their military capacity. So they held on, grimly, expensively, stubbornly, maintaining a string of border fortresses and garrisons that consumed a staggering proportion of the imperial budget. But the Ottoman threat, existential as it was not the only crisis consuming Charles V's attention. Indeed, by the mid-1520s, a challenge had emerged from within Christendom itself that would prove, in the long run, even more destabilizing than any Turkish army. Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg in 1517, 2 years before Charles became emperor. By the time of Mohatch, the Reformation had grown from a theological dispute into a political revolution. German princes who had long chafed under both imperial and papal authority saw in Luther's teachings an opportunity to assert their independence, to seize church lands, and to break the power of Catholic institutions within their territories. The Reformation was not merely about doctrine, it was about power, and it was tearing the Holy Roman Empire apart from within. Charles confronted Luther personally at the Diet of Worms in 1521, one of the great dramatic confrontations of the 16th century. The monk stood before the most powerful ruler in the Christian world and refused to recant. Charles, deeply Catholic, personally conservative, and acutely aware that religious unity was the only force holding his impossibly diverse empire together, was appalled. He reportedly told his courtiers afterward that a single monk could not be right against 1,000 years of Christendom, but Charles could not crush the Reformation no matter how much he wanted to. He needed the German Protestant princes. He needed their soldiers for his wars against France. He needed their taxes for his campaigns against the Ottomans. He needed their cooperation to govern an empire that was ungovernable without consensus. Every time he prepared to move against the Protestants militarily, a new crisis erupted elsewhere. A French invasion of Italy, an Ottoman advance in Hungary, a rebellion in Spain, and he was forced to postpone, to compromise, to grant temporary concessions that became permanent realities. The story of Charles V's reign is in many ways the story of a man trying to hold together a structure that was fundamentally incoherent. He was the most powerful monarch in the world, and he could not solve any of his problems. France under Francis I and later Henry II was a relentless antagonist, fighting 4 major wars against Charles for control of Italy and the Burgundian borderlands. The Ottomans pressed continuously from the east. The Protestant princes formed the Schmalkaldic League, a military alliance dedicated to resisting imperial authority on matters of religion. The Pope, who should have been Charles's natural ally against both the Turks and the Protestants, he was frequently more interested in limiting Habsburg power in Italy than in defending Christendom. Charles fought them all. He won battles. His forces sacked Rome in 1527, defeated the Schmalkaldic League at Mühlberg in 1547, repelled Ottoman raids on the Austrian border. But victories never translated into lasting settlements. Each war consumed treasure that was needed for the next war. The silver pouring in from the Americas, from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, extracted by enslaved indigenous laborers under conditions of almost unimaginable brutality, flowed through the Spanish treasury and out again to pay for armies in Italy, garrisons in Hungary, and fleets in the Mediterranean, leaving Spain rich in accounting and poor in reality. And here we must pause to acknowledge the human cost of the engine that powered Habsburg ambitions. The silver that financed Charles's wars and sustained his empire was mined by indigenous peoples working under a system of forced labor that killed them in enormous numbers. At Potosi, in what is now Bolivia, the mountain that the Spanish called the Cerro Rico in Nigfrish, the Rich Hill, consumed indigenous lives the way a furnace consumes wood. Men entered the mines before dawn and emerged after dark, breathing toxic dust, carrying loads that bent their spines permanently, dying of silicosis, mercury poisoning, and simple exhaustion. The population of the region around Potosi collapsed. Entire communities were destroyed. The wealth that built Habsburg palaces and funded Habsburg armies was extracted at a cost in human suffering that the dynasty's admirers have always preferred not to examine too closely. This was the shadow side of Habsburg power. the suffering that underwrote the splendor. And it would compound over the centuries as Spanish colonial administration refined its methods of extraction and extended them across the Americas, always in the name of the crown, always for the glory of the dynasty, always at someone else's expense. By the mid-1550s, Charles was exhausted. He was only in his mid-50s, but decades of constant travel, constant warfare, and the crushing burden of governing an empire that stretched across half the world had broken him physically and spiritually. He suffered from severe gout that made it difficult to walk. He ate compulsively. Contemporary accounts describe enormous meals consumed in grim silence, as though food could fill the emptiness that power could not. His jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw that had been merely pronounced in his youth, had progressed to the point where he could barely chew. His teeth did not align. His speech was sometimes difficult to understand. In 1555 and 1556, Charles did something that no ruler of his stature had ever done before. He abdicated. He did not simply retire. He dismantled his empire by design, dividing it between the two branches of the family in a partition that would shape European politics for the next 2 centuries. To his son Philip, he gave Spain, the Low Countries, the Italian possessions, and the American colonies, the western half of the Habsburg inheritance, in the part that faced the Atlantic and drew its wealth from the New World. To his brother Ferdinand, who had already been governing Austria and managing the Hungarian frontier for decades, he gave the Austrian lands, the Bohemian crown, the claim to Hungary, and the imperial title. The single Habsburg Empire became two: the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. They remained allied, intermarried, and ideologically united in their commitment to Catholicism and dynastic continuity. But they were no longer one entity. They were two houses built on the same foundation, facing in different directions, each carrying its own burdens and fighting its own battles. Charles retired to a monastery at Yuste in the remote mountains of western Spain. He spent his final 2 years in a modest suite of rooms attached to the Hieronymite monastery, surrounded by clocks. He had always been fascinated by mechanical timepieces and by paintings, including several works by Titian. He ate too much. He prayed. He followed the affairs of Europe with diminishing interest and increasing detachment. He died on September 21st, 1558, at the age of 58, having held more power than any European since the Roman emperors and having discovered that it was not enough. The division Charles imposed would prove both the dynasty's salvation and its limitation. It solved the immediate problem of governing an unmanageable empire by creating two manageable ones. But it also meant that the Habsburgs would never again concentrate the full weight of their power behind a single objective. When Spain needed Austrian help against the Turks, Austria was preoccupied with the German princes. When Austria needed Spanish money for the Hungarian frontier, Spain was spending its treasure in the Netherlands or the Americas. The two branches cooperated, but they never again merged. They were two hands belonging to the same body, but they could not form a single fist. Philip II of Spain, who received the larger and wealthier portion of his father's empire, was in almost every way his father's opposite. Where Charles had been perpetually in motion, Philip was sedentary. He governed from a desk. He built the Escorial, Dais, that massive, austere granite complex outside Madrid that served simultaneously as palace, monastery, library, and tomb, and he governed his worldwide empire from within its walls, reading dispatches, annotating documents in his small, precise handwriting, making decisions that affected millions of people he would never meet and places he would never visit. Philip was meticulous, suspicious, deeply devout, and profoundly convinced that his role as the defender of Catholic Christendom was not merely a political position, but a divine mandate. He saw heresy as a disease and religious dissent as treason. Under his rule, the Spanish Inquisition reached its peak of activity. The Index of Forbidden Books was enforced with renewed vigor. And in the Netherlands, where the Reformation had gained significant ground among the Dutch-speaking population, Philip's attempts to impose religious uniformity would trigger a revolt that would consume Spanish resources for 80 years and ultimately cost the Habsburgs their richest possession. The Dutch revolt, which began in earnest in 1568, was the wound that would not heal. The Low Countries were the most urbanized, most commercially sophisticated, and most culturally vibrant region in Philip's empire. They were also the region where Calvinist Protestantism had taken deepest root among the merchant and artisan classes. Philip's response, sending the Duke of Alba with an army and instructions to crush the heresy by force, was militarily effective in the short term and politically catastrophic in the long term. Alba's Council of Troubles, which the Dutch nicknamed the Council of Blood, executed over 1,000 people and confiscated the property of thousands more. Rather than suppressing the revolt, it inflamed it. The Dutch found a leader in William of Orange, a pragmatic, politically gifted nobleman who unified the fractious Dutch provinces into a resistance movement that combined guerrilla warfare, naval power, and an appeal to international Protestant solidarity. The Spanish army won most of the battles, but winning battles in the Netherlands was like trying to drain a swamp with a teaspoon. The flat, waterlogged landscape favored defense. The Dutch could flood their own fields to stop Spanish advances. The cost of maintaining a permanent army in the Low Countries was ruinous, and Spain was fighting everywhere at once. Philip sent the Armada against England in 1588, partly to stop English support for the Dutch rebels, partly to overthrow the Protestant Queen Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England. The Armada's failure, scattered by English fire ships and destroyed by Atlantic storms, did not end Spanish naval power, as popular mythology suggests, but it demonstrated the limits of what even the world's greatest empire could accomplish when its resources were stretched across too many fronts. Meanwhile, the Austrian Habsburgs were fighting their own battles and learning their own lessons. Ferdinand I, who had received the Austrian inheritance from his brother Charles, proved to be a capable and pragmatic ruler. He understood, perhaps better than Charles ever had, that religious uniformity in the Holy Roman Empire was a fantasy. The German princes who had adopted Protestantism would not be reconverted by force. Attempting to impose Catholicism would only provoke the kind of destructive war that the empire could not survive, not with the Ottomans perpetually threatening from the east. The Ferdinand's pragmatism culminated in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which established the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. Each prince could determine the official religion of his territory. Catholic princes could maintain Catholic states. Lutheran princes could maintain Lutheran states. Subjects who disagreed with their prince's choice were theoretically free to emigrate. It was a compromise. It was incomplete. It excluded Calvinists, ignored the rights of religious minorities within each territory, and left dozens of questions unresolved. But it preserved the peace. For 63 years, from 1555 to 1618, the Holy Roman Empire avoided religious civil war. The Austrian Habsburgs used those decades to strengthen their position, to build institutions, to patronize the arts, and to develop the administrative machinery that would eventually allow them to govern a multi-ethnic empire. They also confronted a question that would haunt them for centuries. What was the Habsburg Empire actually for? The Spanish branch had a clear identity. It was the sword of Catholic Christendom, the master of the Americas, the guardian of the Mediterranean. But the Austrian branch was something less defined and in many ways more interesting. It was a collection of territories, Austria, Bohemia, parts of Hungary, various smaller domains, that shared no common language, no common ethnicity, and no common culture beyond their allegiance to the Habsburg crown. The Austrians spoke German, the Bohemians spoke Czech, the Hungarians spoke Hungarian, the Croatians spoke Croatian. Within each territory, there were further divisions: German-speaking minorities in Bohemia, Hungarian-speaking minorities in the Austrian lands, and everywhere scattered communities of Jews, Roma, and other groups who belonged to none of the dominant nations. Governing this mosaic required a different kind of statecraft than governing a nation-state. It required tolerance. or at least the appearance of tolerance. It required flexibility. It required the ability to speak different languages of legitimacy to different audiences, divine right to the devout, ancient privilege to the nobles, economic opportunity to the merchants, military protection to the border communities. The Austrian Habsburgs became, out of necessity, masters of this pragmatic pluralism. They did not celebrate diversity. The concept would have been incomprehensible to them, de Urumbus, but they managed it, with varying degrees of success, for 400 years. This was the quiet genius of the Austrian Habsburg model, and it was also its fundamental vulnerability. An empire held together by dynastic loyalty rather than national identity could endure as long as dynastic loyalty remained a compelling force. The moment it ceased to be, the moment people began to define themselves primarily as Czechs or Hungarians or Serbs rather than as subjects of the Habsburg crown, the empire would have no answer. But that crisis lay centuries in the future. In the late 16th century, the more immediate problem was holding the fragile religious peace together. And it was here, in the opening decades of the 17th century, that the Habsburgs would face the greatest test in their long history, a catastrophe so immense that it would kill more people, in proportional terms, than any conflict in European history until the 20th century. The Peace of Augsburg had been a bandage, not a cure. Its terms were ambiguous, its enforcement mechanisms weak, and its exclusion of Calvinism increasingly untenable as Calvinist communities grew throughout the empire. By the early 1600s, the religious balance in the Holy Roman Empire was fraying. Catholic and Protestant princes viewed each other with deepening suspicion. Both sides formed military alliances. Both sides accumulated weapons. The empire was a room full of gunpowder, and everyone knew it. What no one knew was where the spark would come from. It came from Prague. On the morning of May 23, 1618, a group of Bohemian Protestant nobles marched into Prague Castle, confronted two Catholic imperial governors and their secretary, and threw all three of them out of a third-story window. The men survived the fall. Catholic propagandists claimed they were saved by angels, while Protestant wits noted that they had landed in a dung heap, but the act itself was an unmistakable declaration of war. The defenestration of Prague, as it became known, was a direct challenge to Habsburg authority in Bohemia, a rejection of the Catholic reconversion campaign that the Habsburg king Ferdinand II had been pursuing with increasing aggression, and a signal to every discontented Protestant in the empire that the time for armed resistance had arrived. Ferdinand II was not the kind of man who responded to such signals with compromise. He was a Jesuit-educated zealot, utterly convinced of the righteousness of the Catholic cause, and utterly determined to reimpose religious unity on his domains regardless of the cost. Where his predecessors had bent, Ferdinand would break. Where they had accommodated, he would crush. He was, in the estimation of most historians, the Habsburg ruler most directly responsible for the catastrophe that followed. What followed was the 30 Years' War. It was not a single war, but a cascading series of conflicts that fed upon each other, drawing in kingdom after kingdom, army after army, until virtually every major power in Europe was involved, and the German-speaking lands at the empire's heart had been transformed into a charnel house. The war began as a Bohemian rebellion, and might have ended as one. The Protestant Bohemian estates deposed Ferdinand as their king, and offered the crown to Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, a young, ambitious Calvinist prince who was married to Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of King James I of England. Frederick accepted. It was the worst decision of his life. Ferdinand, newly elected as Holy Roman Emperor, responded with overwhelming force. He called upon the Catholic League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria. He secured the support of the Spanish Habsburgs, who sent money and troops from the Low Countries. He recruited the Lutheran Elector of Saxony, who feared Calvinist expansion more than he feared Habsburg power. And in November 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain just outside Prague, the combined Catholic forces destroyed the Bohemian rebel army in less than 2 hours. Frederick fled. he would be mocked for the rest of his brief life as the Winter King. The man who had worn a crown for a single season, his Bohemian supporters were not so fortunate. Ferdinand's reprisals were systematic and merciless. 27 leaders of the rebellion were executed in the Old Town Square of Prague on June 21, 1621, in a carefully staged spectacle of state terror. Their heads were displayed on the Charles Bridge. The estates of Protestant nobles were confiscated and redistributed to Catholic loyalists. The Czech language was suppressed in official use. The University of Prague was placed under Jesuit control. Bohemian Protestantism was not merely defeated. It was, over the following decades, methodically eradicated. The re-Catholicization of Bohemia was, in Ferdinand's mind, a model for what he intended to do throughout the empire, and for a time, it seemed as though he might succeed. Catholic forces won victory after victory in the early 1620s. The brilliant general Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian nobleman of enigmatic loyalties and bottomless ambition, raised enormous armies at his own expense and swept through northern Germany, defeating Protestant forces wherever he found them. By 1629, Ferdinand felt strong enough to issue the Edict of Restitution, which ordered the return of all church properties that had been secularized since 1552, a sweeping reversal of decades of Protestant gains that, if enforced, would have reshaped the religious and political geography of the entire empire. It was the high watermark of Habsburg power in the 30 Years' War. It was also the moment when everything began to go wrong. The Edict of Restitution alarmed not just Protestants but Catholic princes as well. Maximilian of Bavaria, Ferdinand's most important ally, saw the edict as an extension of imperial power that threatened the independence of all princes, Catholic or not. The German electors forced Ferdinand to dismiss Wallenstein, whose enormous army and unclear personal agenda had become a threat to everyone. And from the north, a new and terrifying antagonist entered the war. Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, landed on the German coast in the summer of 1630 with a professional army that was, man for man, the most effective fighting force in Europe. Gustavus was a military genius, perhaps the greatest battlefield commander of the 17th century. He had reformed the Swedish army from the ground up, introducing lighter and more mobile artillery, combining infantry and cavalry in coordinated tactical formations, and instilling in his soldiers a discipline and ferocity that terrified their opponents. He was also a devout Lutheran who genuinely believed he was fighting for the survival of the Protestant faith. His intervention transformed the war. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in September 1631, Gustavus destroyed the main Catholic army under the veteran commander Tilly. It was the first major Protestant victory of the war, and it shattered the aura of Catholic invincibility that had hung over the conflict since White Mountain. Swedish forces swept through central Germany, and for a dizzying moment it seemed possible that the entire Habsburg position might collapse. Ferdinand recalled Wallenstein. The general, nursing his grudge but still the only man capable of raising and commanding the forces Ferdinand needed, assembled a new army and confronted Gustavus at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632. The battle was a tactical Swedish victory, but it came at an unbearable cost. Gustavus Adolphus was killed in the fighting, shot from his horse during a cavalry charge, and finished off on the ground, his body found hours later riddled with bullet and sword wounds. The war did not end with Gustavus's death. Nothing ended. That was the horror of it. The conflict had developed its own momentum, its own logic, its own appetite. Armies needed to be fed, and the simplest way to feed an army was to march it into territory that had not yet been plundered and let it take what it needed. Soldiers who had not been paid in months, sometimes years, sustained themselves by stealing from the civilian population. Villages that resisted were burned. Towns that opened their gates were occupied and stripped of everything portable. The distinction between soldier and bandit, between military campaign and organized robbery, dissolved entirely in large parts of Germany. Wallenstein himself became a victim of the war's corrosive logic. His growing independence, his secret negotiations with Protestant powers, and his increasingly erratic behavior convinced Ferdinand that the general had become more dangerous as an ally than as an enemy. In February 1634, Wallenstein was assassinated at Eger by a group of his own officers acting on the emperor's implicit orders. They killed him in his bedroom, or running him through with a pike as he rose from his chair. The greatest military mind of the Catholic cause was eliminated not by the enemy but by the dynasty he served. The war ground on. France, under Cardinal Richelieu, entered the conflict in 1635 in a Catholic power fighting against the Catholic Habsburgs, because Richelieu understood that the real struggle was not about religion, but about the balance of power in Europe. French intervention prolonged the war by another 13 years and ensured that when peace finally came, it would come on terms that the Habsburgs had not chosen. The human cost of the 30 Years' War defies easy comprehension. The population of the German-speaking lands dropped by an estimated 25 to 40%. Some regions lost more than half their inhabitants. Entire districts were depopulated. And cities that had been centers of culture and commerce were reduced to shells inhabited by a fraction of their pre-war population. The mechanisms of death were various and reinforcing: battle, massacre, famine, and above all, disease. Armies carried plague, typhus, and dysentery with them like invisible companions, and these diseases killed far more people than any sword or musket ball. The village of Oberammergau, in the Bavarian Alps, lost 84 of its 700 inhabitants to plague in 1633. The survivors made a vow if God would spare the village from further suffering, they would perform the Passion of Christ every 10 years for the rest of time. They kept that vow. The Oberammergau Passion Play is still performed today every decade, a living artifact of 17th century desperation that tourists visit without always understanding what it commemorates. Contemporaries described landscapes that resembled the aftermath of apocalypse. The writer Hans Jakob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen, who lived through the war as a child and later wrote its greatest literary account, The Adventures of Simplicissimus, describes scenes of such casual brutality that modern readers sometimes mistake them for fiction. Soldiers forcing peasants to drink urine, children eating the flesh of dead horses, families huddled in forests through winter wearing rags, surviving on bark and roots. These were not exceptional horrors. They were the daily texture of life in large swaths of Central Europe for a generation. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648 after years of exhausting negotiation in the cities of Münster and Osnabrück, ended the war by essentially ratifying the empire's fragmentation. The sovereignty of individual German states was confirmed. The Calvinists were finally recognized alongside Catholics and Lutherans. The power of the Holy Roman Emperor was formally reduced to something approaching ceremonial status within Germany. France gained territory along the Rhine. Sweden gained territory along the Baltic coast. The Dutch Republic's independence from Spain was formally acknowledged. For the Habsburgs, Westphalia was a humiliation disguised as a peace treaty. The dream of a unified Catholic empire under Habsburg leadership, the dream that had driven Ferdinand II to war in the first place, was dead. And the Holy Roman Empire would continue to exist in name for another century and a half, but it was now more than ever what Voltaire would later quip it had always been: neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and yet the Habsburgs survived. They always survived. That was their particular genius. Not the ability to win, but the ability to endure, to lose a war and retain a throne, to cede territory and maintain a dynasty, to accept a diminished present while quietly positioning themselves for a larger future. The decades following Westphalia were a period of recalibration. The Spanish branch of the family was in visible decline. The Dutch Republic was lost. The economy was stagnant. The military was overstretched. And the dynasty itself was literally dying out. Its gene pool so constricted by generations of intermarriage that the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, was a medical catastrophe of such severity that his story borders on the grotesque. But the Austrian branch was different. It still held Austria, Bohemia, and Western Hungary. It still bore the imperial title, and it was about to demonstrate once again the Habsburg talent for turning crisis into opportunity. The crisis came, as it so often did, from the east. In the summer of 1683, an Ottoman army numbering perhaps 150,000 men marched through Hungary and laid siege to Vienna itself. The siege of Vienna was the moment when the Ottoman threat to Christian Europe reached its absolute zenith, the closest the Ottomans ever came to breaking through into the heartland of the continent. The Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha had assembled the largest Ottoman army to march into Europe in decades. His forces encircled the city, dug trenches toward the walls, and began a systematic bombardment with mines and artillery designed to breach Vienna's fortifications and allow a final assault. Inside the city, the situation deteriorated by the day. Emperor Leopold I had fled before the siege began, a decision that was probably militarily sensible, since it allowed him to organize relief efforts from a safe distance, but that nonetheless reinforced the image of Habsburg rulers as men more comfortable in a palace than on a battlefield. The defense fell to Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, as a tough and experienced soldier who commanded a garrison of roughly 15,000 troops and managed the city's civilian population with a mixture of iron discipline and calculated reassurance. For 2 months, through the scorching heat of a continental summer, the defenders held. The Ottoman sappers dug ever closer to the walls, detonating mines that collapsed sections of the fortifications and opened gaps that had to be sealed with desperate counterattacks. Disease spread through the overcrowded city. Food supplies dwindled. The smell of death hung over Vienna like a permanent fog. The bodies of soldiers killed in the fighting, the corpses of horses butchered for meat, the victims of dysentery and infection who died in makeshift hospitals that were little more than open-air charnel houses. Starhemberg sent messenger after messenger through the Ottoman lines, begging for the relief force he had been promised. He launched rockets into the night sky as signals of his desperation, and he held the walls day after day, repelling assault after assault, patching breaches with rubble and furniture and anything else that could slow the Ottoman advance. The relief force was assembling, but slowly. Habsburg diplomacy, patient, persistent, and for once genuinely urgent, had assembled a coalition that included Polish, German, and Austrian forces. The key figure was Jan III Sobieski, King of Poland, who had agreed to lead the relief army in exchange for papal encouragement and the promise of lasting glory. Sobieski was a seasoned warrior, a man of considerable personal courage, and he understood that the fall of Vienna would expose his own kingdom to Ottoman invasion. On September 12th, 1683, the relief army arrived on the Kahlenberg Heights above Vienna and looked down at the Ottoman camp spread across the plain below. What followed was one of the largest cavalry charges in history. Sobieski commanded the center, leading the famous Polish winged hussars, armored horsemen carrying enormous feathered frames on their backs that created a terrifying visual and acoustic effect as they galloped toward the enemy. The charge of approximately 20,000 horsemen, Polish and German together, struck the Ottoman lines in the late afternoon and shattered them. Kara Mustafa's army disintegrated. The Ottoman retreat became a rout. Soldiers abandoned their equipment, their tents, their supplies, their weapons. The Grand Vizier himself fled with such haste that his personal tent, filled with treasures, was captured intact. Among the items found in the Ottoman camp, according to persistent legend, were sacks of coffee beans, an unfamiliar commodity that the Viennese would soon transform into the foundation of their café culture, a tradition that endures to this day. Kara Mustafa did not long survive his failure. The Sultan had him strangled with a silk cord in Belgrade on Christmas Day, 1683, the traditional Ottoman method of executing high officials whose incompetence had brought disgrace upon the empire. The relief of Vienna was a turning point not just for the Habsburgs, but for the Ottoman Empire as well. In the years that followed, Habsburg forces, now allied with Poland, Venice, and eventually Russia in a holy league organized by the Pope, pushed the Ottomans out of Hungary entirely. Buda, which had been under Ottoman control for nearly a century and a half, was recaptured in 1686 after a brutal siege that reduced the city to rubble. Belgrade fell in 1688. The great general Prince Eugene of Savoy, a small, ungainly man whom Louis XIV of France had rejected for military service, and who became the finest commander of his generation, won a series of crushing victories that permanently shifted the balance of power in southeastern Europe. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 confirmed the new reality. The Ottomans ceded virtually all of Hungary, Transylvania, and Croatia to the Habsburgs. For the first time in over a century and a half, the Kingdom of Hungary was reunified under a single Christian ruler. And the bleeding wound at the empire's eastern frontier had finally been closed. The consequences of this transformation were enormous. The Habsburg Empire roughly doubled in size. It now stretched from the Rhine to the Carpathians, from the Bohemian forests to the Adriatic coast. It was by any measure a great power, one of the 4 or 5 states that would dominate European politics for the next 2 centuries. But the new territories brought new problems. Hungary had been devastated by a century and a half of war. Large areas were depopulated. The infrastructure was destroyed. The Hungarian nobility, which had maintained its traditions and its sense of national identity through the long Ottoman occupation, was fiercely protective of its privileges and deeply suspicious of Habsburg centralization. Transylvania had its own complex ethnic mix of Hungarians, Romanians, and Germans, each with its own grievances and ambitions. Governing these territories required a delicacy and a patience that not every Habsburg ruler possessed. And there was a deeper problem still. The Habsburg Empire of the late 17th century was now truly a multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multi-religious entity on a scale that no previous European state had attempted. Its subjects spoke German, Czech, Hungarian, Croatian, Romanian, Polish, Italian, and a dozen other languages. They worshipped as Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Muslims. They identified with local traditions that stretched back centuries and owed little to the Habsburg crown beyond a grudging acceptance of its authority as the lesser of available evils. This empire had no national anthem because it had no nation. It had no founding myth because it had too many origins. It was held together by 3 things: the dynasty, the army, and the Catholic Church. When all 3 were strong, the empire cohered. When anyone faltered, the centrifugal forces began to spin. The early 18th century brought yet another crisis and yet another opportunity. Charles II of Spain, the last Spanish Habsburg, had died in 1700 without an heir. His will left the entire Spanish Empire to Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, a gift that, if accepted, would unite the crowns of France and Spain under a single Bourbon dynasty and create a superpower that would dominate Europe absolutely. The Austrian Habsburgs could not accept this. Neither could England, the Dutch Republic, or virtually any other European state that feared French hegemony. The result was the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714 and involved every major power on the continent. The Austrian Habsburg candidate for the Spanish throne was Archduke Charles, the younger son of Emperor Leopold I. Charles traveled to Spain, established a court in Barcelona, and fought a bitter civil war against Philip's supporters with the backing of English, Dutch, and Austrian troops. Prince Eugene of Savoy won spectacular victories against the French in Italy and the Low Countries. The Duke of Marlborough, commanding the English and Allied forces, won the famous battles of Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde. For a time, it seemed possible that the Habsburgs might reclaim Spain. But then, in 1711, the unexpected happened, as it so often did in Habsburg history. Emperor Joseph I, Charles's older brother, died suddenly of smallpox. Charles was now the sole male Habsburg heir. If he also became King of Spain, He would recreate the empire of Charles V, the very concentration of power that the war was supposedly being fought to prevent. England and the Dutch Republic, which had been fighting to keep Spain out of French hands, realized that putting it in Habsburg hands was equally unacceptable. The peace treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt, signed in 1713 and 1714, gave Spain to the Bourbons, but the Habsburgs received significant compensation. The Spanish Netherlands, which became the Austrian Netherlands, along with Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. These were valuable territories, but they were not Spain. The Spanish Habsburg inheritance, by the branch that had ruled from the Escorial and commanded the wealth of the Americas, was gone. The dynasty that had once bestride the world like a colossus now governed from Vienna alone. It was, in one sense, a defeat. In another sense, it was a clarification. The Austrian Habsburgs could now focus entirely on their Central European empire, on building the administrative, cultural, and military institutions that would sustain the dynasty for another 2 centuries. And it was in this period, the 18th century, that the Habsburg Empire became something recognizable to the modern eye. Not a medieval feudal conglomerate, not a dynastic accident held together by marriage contracts and legal fictions, but a functioning state with a bureaucracy, a standing army, a tax system, and an identity, however contested, however fragile, of its own. The architect of this transformation was a woman, and her story is one of the most remarkable in the entire Habsburg saga. When Emperor Charles VI died in October 1740, he left no sons. His heir, according to the Pragmatic Sanction, a legal instrument he had spent decades persuading the other European powers to accept, was his 23-year-old daughter, Maria Theresa. She inherited an empire on the brink of dismemberment. Every major power in Europe immediately moved to take a piece. Frederick II of Prussia, a man who would earn the title the Great through methods that were, depending on one's perspective, brilliantly strategic or nakedly predatory, invaded Silesia within weeks of Charles VI's death. His justification was a decades-old Brandenburg claim to the province that no one, including Frederick himself, took seriously as a legal argument. His real reasoning was simpler. Silesia was rich, it was strategically valuable, and the person now sitting on the Habsburg throne was a young woman with no military experience, no reliable allies, and no reason to believe she could hold her inheritance together. Frederick was not alone in his assessment. France, Spain, Bavaria, and Saxony all saw an opportunity to dismember the Habsburg domains. The Elector of Bavaria, Charles Albert, claimed the Habsburg inheritance for himself and, with French backing, had himself elected Holy Roman Emperor, the first non-Habsburg to hold the title in 3 centuries. It seemed for a brief and terrifying moment that the dynasty's 600-year ascent had finally reached its end. Maria Theresa had none of the advantages that her male predecessors had enjoyed. She had received no military training. She had been excluded from the deliberations of state during her father's reign. The treasury was empty, the army was poorly equipped and badly led. The diplomatic alliances her father had spent his reign constructing, the guarantees that the other powers would respect the Pragmatic Sanction, turned out to be worth exactly nothing the moment they were tested. What Maria Theresa did have was a quality that no amount of diplomatic preparation could substitute for and no amount of military force could defeat. She refused to accept what everyone else considered inevitable. She refused to negotiate the partition of her inheritance. She refused to cede Silesia without a fight. She refused to abdicate, to compromise, or to despair. She was, in the words of one modern historian, the most dangerous thing a complacent opponent can face, a person with nothing to lose and an absolute conviction that surrender is not among the available options. Her first masterstroke was emotional rather than military. In September 1741, Maria Theresa traveled to Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava, and appeared before the Hungarian Diet, the assembly of Hungarian nobles whose support she desperately needed. She came dressed in mourning for her father, carrying her infant son Joseph in her arms. She spoke to the assembled nobles in Latin. the official language of the Hungarian Diet. And she did something that Habsburg rulers almost never did. She asked for help. The scene has been romanticized in countless retellings, and separating fact from legend is difficult. And the traditional version holds that the Hungarian nobles, moved by the sight of their young queen and her child, leaped to their feet, drew their swords, and cried, "Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro," our lives and our blood for our king. The use of the masculine rege rather than the feminine regina was deliberate, a gesture of respect that acknowledged Maria Theresa as their sovereign with the full authority of a king. Whether the scene unfolded with quite that theatrical precision is debatable. What is not debatable is the result. The Hungarian nobles pledged their support, raised troops, and provided Maria Theresa with the military resources she needed to survive the first and most dangerous years of her reign. It was a transaction, not a gift. The Hungarians extracted significant concessions in return, including confirmations of their ancient privileges and a degree of autonomy that would complicate Habsburg governance for generations. But it saved the dynasty. The War of the Austrian Succession lasted 8 years, from 1740 to 1748, and when it ended, Maria Theresa had lost Silesia to Frederick. A loss she never accepted and never forgave, but had held everything else. Bavaria's claim to the Habsburg inheritance had collapsed. The French had been fought to a standstill. Charles Albert of Bavaria, the non-Habsburg emperor, had died in 1745, and Maria Theresa's husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, had been elected in his place, restoring the imperial title to the family. The empire had been tested to its breaking point and had not broken. Maria Theresa spent the next decade preparing for revenge. She reformed the army, reorganized the tax system, modernized the bureaucracy, and, in a diplomatic revolution that stunned Europe, allied Austria with its ancient enemy France against Frederick's Prussia. The 7 Years' War that followed from 1756 to 1763 was supposed to be the war that recovered Silesia and humbled Prussia forever. It failed. Frederick, fighting against a coalition that included Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden, survived through a combination of military brilliance, sheer stubbornness, and extraordinary luck, including the sudden death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth in 1762, which brought to the throne Peter III, an admirer of Frederick, who immediately withdrew from the war. Silesia remained Prussian. Maria Theresa, for the second time, had to accept a peace that left her most bitter enemy in possession of her richest province. She never got over it. Decades later, she still referred to Frederick as that wicked man, and regarded the loss of Silesia as the great failure of her reign. But if Maria Theresa failed as a war leader, she succeeded magnificently as something perhaps more important, a state builder. The reforms she implemented during her 40-year reign transformed the Habsburg Empire from a loose collection of territories held together by dynastic loyalty into something approaching a modern centralized state. She standardized the tax system, bringing the nobility under fiscal obligations they had previously evaded. She reformed the education system, establishing mandatory schooling for children between the ages of 6 and 12, a revolutionary measure for its time. She reorganized the provincial administration by replacing the patchwork of local privileges and exemptions with a more uniform system of governance. She reformed the military, improving training, equipment, and logistics. She established a census. She codified the law. These reforms were not inspired by Enlightenment idealism. Maria Theresa was a deeply conservative Catholic who distrusted the philosophes and their abstract theorizing about human rights and social contracts. Her motivation was purely practical. She had nearly lost her empire because it was badly organized, inefficiently governed, and unable to mobilize its resources effectively. She reformed it so that she would never be that vulnerable again. Her reforms were driven not by love of progress, but by fear of extinction. And yet the effect was progressive regardless of the motivation. A standardized education system, even one designed to produce obedient subjects, also produced literate citizens. A rationalized bureaucracy, even one designed to extract taxes more efficiently, also provided more consistent governance. A codified legal system, even one that preserved noble privilege, also established the principle that law should be written down, publicly known, and uniformly applied. Maria Theresa planted seeds whose fruit she would not have recognized and might not have approved. Her relationship with her son and co-regent Joseph II was the great personal drama of her later years, and it illuminated a tension that would define the Habsburg Empire for the next century. Joseph was everything his mother was not: impatient, idealistic, intellectually ambitious, and utterly convinced that the Enlightenment's principles could and should be applied to the governance of a multi-ethnic empire. Where Maria Theresa reformed cautiously, preserving tradition wherever possible, Joseph wanted to revolutionize. Where she respected the church's authority, Joseph wanted to subordinate it to the state. Where she accepted the nobility's privileges as a necessary evil, Joseph wanted to abolish them. Mother and son clashed repeatedly during the 15 years of their co-regency, from 1765 until Maria Theresa's death in 1780. She blocked his most radical proposals. He chafed at her conservatism. Their correspondence, extensive, intimate, and frequently heated, reveals two people who loved each other deeply and understood each other not at all. Maria Theresa saw in Joseph a reckless idealist who would destroy the delicate compromises that held the empire together. Joseph saw in his mother a timid woman clinging to a dying order. Maria Theresa died on November 29, 1780, at the age of 63, sitting upright in a chair because her lungs were too congested to allow her to lie down. She had been empress for 40 years. She had borne 16 children, of whom 10 survived to adulthood. She had held together an empire that everyone had expected to fall apart. She had lost Silesia and gained something more valuable: a functioning state. Joseph II, finally free of his mother's restraining influence, unleashed a torrent of reforms that astonished and alarmed his subjects in equal measure. In the decade between Maria Theresa's death and his own in 1790, Joseph issued over 6,000 decrees, an average of nearly 2 per day. He abolished serfdom. He granted religious tolerance to Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews through the Patent of Toleration in 1781. He dissolved hundreds of monasteries and redirected their wealth to hospitals and schools. He reformed the legal system, abolishing torture and limiting the death penalty. He attempted to impose German as the universal language of administration throughout the empire. He tried to rationalize the tax system by taxing the nobility on the same basis as the peasantry. Each reform taken individually was reasonable. Taken together, they constituted a revolution imposed from above, without consultation, without preparation, and without any understanding of how deeply they would be resisted by the very people they were supposed to help. The Hungarian nobles who had saved the dynasty in 1741 were outraged by Joseph's attempt to bypass their traditional privileges and impose direct rule from Vienna. The Bohemian nobles resented the centralization. The Belgian provinces, which had their own ancient liberties and their own institutional traditions, erupted in open revolt. The Catholic clergy, stripped of their monasteries and their influence over education, turned against the emperor who was supposed to be their protector. Joseph had made the classic Enlightenment error. He had confused the rationality of a policy with its political viability. A reform that made perfect sense on paper could be catastrophic in practice if it ignored the traditions, the fears, and the identities of the people it affected. Joseph treated the empire as a machine to be redesigned. His subjects experienced it as a home being demolished around them. By the end of his reign, Joseph was forced to revoke many of his most important reforms. Hungary received its privileges back. The Belgian provinces were pacified with concessions. The tax reform was abandoned. Joseph died in February 1790 at the age of 48, exhausted and disillusioned. He composed his own epitaph: "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in everything he undertook." It was too harsh a judgment. Many of Joseph's reforms survived his death, and those that were revoked were often reinstated by later rulers under different names. The abolition of serfdom was permanent. Religious tolerance once granted could not be entirely retracted. The principle of state sovereignty over the church had been established. Joseph had gone too far, too fast, but the direction he had pointed in was the direction the empire eventually traveled. His successors learned from his mistakes. Leopold II, Joseph's brother, who reigned for barely 2 years before dying in 1792, was a skilled diplomat who managed to stabilize the empire by reversing Joseph's most inflammatory measures while quietly preserving his most useful ones. Leopold understood what Joseph had not, that in a multi-ethnic empire the process of reform mattered as much as its content. You could not simply decree change. You had to negotiate it, compromise on it, allow each constituent group to feel that its voice had been heard even if the outcome was predetermined. But Leopold's brief reign was overshadowed by an event that would reshape Europe far more dramatically than any Habsburg reform, the French Revolution. The revolution that began in Paris in 1789 was, in one sense, the fulfillment of the Enlightenment ideals that Joseph II had tried to impose from above. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These were concepts that Joseph would have recognized even if his interpretation of them was more autocratic than democratic. But the revolution quickly evolved into something that threatened every monarchy in Europe, and the Habsburg monarchy most of all. The Habsburgs had a personal stake in the revolution that no other dynasty shared: Marie Antoinette, the queen whose extravagance and perceived indifference to popular suffering had made her the most hated woman in France. Was Maria Theresa's youngest daughter. She had been married to Louis XVI at the age of 14, sent to France as a living embodiment of the Franco-Austrian alliance, and she had grown into a woman who was both more sympathetic and more complex than the caricature that revolutionary propaganda made of her. Her execution by guillotine in October 1793, following her husband's by 9 months, sent shockwaves through every royal court in Europe. If the French could kill their queen, a daughter of the Habsburgs, then no throne was safe. The wars that followed the revolution, first the Revolutionary Wars, then the Napoleonic Wars, would consume Europe for the next 22 years and would test the Habsburg Empire more severely than anything since the 30 Years' War. Napoleon Bonaparte was, in every sense, the antithesis of the Habsburg model. Where the Habsburgs accumulated power slowly through marriage and patience, Napoleon seized it rapidly through conquest and personal genius. Where the Habsburgs governed through tradition, compromise, and institutional complexity, Napoleon governed through force of will and the imposition of rational, uniform systems. Where the Habsburgs represented the old European order, dynastic, aristocratic, multi-ethnic, and Catholic, Napoleon represented its destruction and replacement with something new: the nation-state, the meritocratic society, the codified law, the citizen army. The Austrian army fought Napoleon repeatedly and lost almost every time. The defeats were devastating. At Austerlitz in December 1805, Napoleon destroyed the combined Austrian and Russian armies in what military historians still regard as one of the most brilliant tactical victories in the history of warfare. Emperor Francis II, who had already in 1804 preemptively declared himself Emperor of Austria, creating a new title to replace the one he was about to lose, was forced to dissolve the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. The institution that had defined Central European politics for over 800 years, the empire that Rudolf of Habsburg had won in 1273, ceased to exist with a stroke of Napoleon's pen. It was on paper the most catastrophic moment in Habsburg history. The dynasty had lost its most ancient and prestigious title. Its military had been humiliated. Its territories had been reduced. Napoleon had redrawn the map of Germany, creating the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of French satellite states that excluded Austria entirely. The Habsburgs were being pushed to the margins of European power, and yet, even in this extremity, the Habsburgs found a way to survive. Their method, characteristically, was not military but matrimonial. In 1810, Emperor Francis offered his eldest daughter, Marie-Louise, as a bride to Napoleon himself. The man who had destroyed the Holy Roman Empire, humiliated the Austrian army, and redrawn the map of Europe, was welcomed into the Habsburg family through marriage. It was an act of breathtaking cynicism, or breathtaking pragmatism, depending on one's perspective. Napoleon wanted legitimacy. He wanted to connect himself to the oldest ruling dynasty in Europe. He wanted an heir, which his first wife Josephine had been unable to give him. The Habsburgs gave him all of these things, and in exchange, they bought time. The architect of this strategy was Clemens von Metternich, who had become Austria's foreign minister in 1809 and who would dominate European diplomacy for the next 4 decades. Metternich was tall, vain, devastatingly charming, and possessed of a political intelligence that operated on a level most of his contemporaries could not perceive. He understood that Napoleon's empire, built on personal genius and military force, was inherently fragile. It had no dynasty. It had no tradition. It had no organic connection to the peoples it governed. It would last exactly as long as Napoleon kept winning battles. In the moment he lost, Metternich was coldly certain that eventually he would lose. The entire structure would collapse. Metternich's job was to ensure that when that collapse came, Austria would be positioned to benefit from it. He maintained the alliance with Napoleon just long enough, switched sides at precisely the right moment, joining the coalition against France in 1813 after Napoleon's catastrophic Russian campaign had broken the Grand Army, and then positioned Austria as the indispensable mediator at the peace table. The Congress of Vienna, which convened in the autumn of 1814 and continued through the first half of 1815, was Metternich's masterpiece. The great powers of Europe, Austria, Britain, Russia, and Prussia, with defeated France represented by the wily Talleyrand, gathered in the Habsburg capital to redesign the continent after 22 years of war. The social spectacle was extraordinary. The Congress was accompanied by an endless round of balls, banquets, concerts, and theatrical performances. The Austrian emperor hosted lavishly, spending money the treasury did not have to create an impression of confidence and stability that the empire did not entirely possess. The Prince de Ligne, an aging Belgian nobleman, famously quipped that the Congress danced but did not advance. Behind the dancing, however, Metternich was conducting a diplomatic campaign of remarkable skill. His goal was not to punish France. A punished France would seek revenge, as it had after previous defeats, but to create a balance of power that would prevent any single state from dominating Europe as Napoleon had done. This meant containing Russia, whose armies had marched to Paris, and whose Tsar Alexander I had messianic visions of reshaping Europe according to his own principles. It meant restraining Prussia, whose military power had grown enormously during the Napoleonic Wars, and it meant preserving the Habsburg Empire as the keystone of the European arch, the power whose geographic position and multi-ethnic character made it the natural counterweight to both Russian expansionism and Prussian ambition. The settlement that emerged from Vienna gave Austria the presidency of the new German Confederation that replaced the Holy Roman Empire. It restored Habsburg control over northern Italy, including the wealthy provinces of Lombardy and Venetia. It created a European order based on conservative principles, the legitimacy of established dynasties, the suppression of revolutionary movements, the maintenance of the social hierarchy. This was the system that historians call the Concert of Europe, and for the next 3 decades, it kept the peace. Metternich's system was brilliant. It was also, in a fundamental sense, a rearguard action against the forces that would eventually destroy it. The French Revolution and Napoleon had unleashed 2 ideas that could not be put back in the bottle: nationalism and liberalism. Nationalism held that every people defined by a common language and culture deserved its own state. Liberalism held that governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, not from divine right or dynastic inheritance. Both ideas were existential threats to the Habsburg Empire. If every nation deserved its own state, then the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Italians, the Poles, the Croats, and the Romanians living under Habsburg rule all had a right to independence. If governments required popular consent, then the entire structure of Habsburg authority, unelected, dynastic, imposed from above, was illegitimate. Metternich understood this perfectly. His response was suppression. Censorship was pervasive. Secret police monitored political discussions, opened mail, and maintained networks of informants. Universities were closely watched. Political associations were banned. The press was muzzled. Metternich's Austria became a byword for reactionary conservatism, a state that prioritized order above all else and treated any demand for change as a symptom of revolutionary contagion. The system worked as long as the forces it was suppressing remained weak and disorganized. It worked as long as the economy provided enough prosperity to keep the middle classes quiescent. It worked as long as the dynasty itself produced rulers capable of maintaining the delicate balance between repression and accommodation. And then in the spring of 1848, it stopped working all at once. The year 1848 began with a revolution in Sicily in January and spread like wildfire across the continent. Paris erupted in February, Berlin in March, Milan, Venice, Budapest, Prague, one by one, the great cities of Europe caught flame. But nowhere was the conflagration more dangerous, more complex, or more revealing than in the Habsburg Empire, because nowhere else did revolution take so many forms simultaneously. In Vienna, the revolution was liberal. Students and workers took to the streets demanding a constitution, a free press, and an end to Metternich's suffocating system of censorship and surveillance. On March 13th, crowds stormed the Landhaus, the seat of the Lower Austrian estates, and clashed with imperial troops. Soldiers fired into the crowd. Barricades went up across the city. Within hours, the man who had dominated European diplomacy for a generation, who had engineered the Congress of Vienna, contained Napoleon's legacy, and maintained the conservative order for 33 years, was finished. Metternich resigned, slipping out of Vienna disguised, according to some accounts, in a laundry cart, and fled to England. He was 74 years old. The system he had built collapsed faster than it had taken him to construct it. In Budapest, the revolution was national. The Hungarian liberal leader Lajos Kossuth delivered a speech to the Hungarian Diet on March 3rd that electrified the empire. He demanded responsible government for Hungary, an end to feudal obligations, and the establishment of a constitutional order that would give the Hungarian nation sovereignty over its own affairs. His words were printed, distributed, read aloud in coffee houses and public squares, and they crystallized decades of Hungarian resentment into a coherent political program. Within weeks, the Habsburg court in Vienna, reeling from its own revolutionary crisis, conceded almost everything Kossuth demanded. Hungary received its own parliament, its own ministry, and effective self-governance. The ancient privileges of the Hungarian nobility were confirmed and extended. Serfdom was abolished. For a brief, euphoric spring, it seemed as though the empire could be transformed peacefully from within. In Prague, the revolution was Slavic. Czech intellectuals and political leaders, inspired by the same nationalist fervor that was transforming Hungary, convened a Pan-Slav Congress in June 1848, an assembly that brought together representatives of the empire's Czech, Slovak, Polish, Croatian, Serbian, and Slovenian populations. The Congress was an attempt to articulate a vision of Slavic solidarity within the Habsburg framework, not independence from the empire, but reorganization of the empire along national lines, giving Slavic peoples the same rights and recognition that German speakers and Hungarians enjoyed. The Czech historian František Palacký, the Congress's intellectual leader, articulated a position that would echo through Habsburg politics for the next 70 years. If the Austrian Empire did not exist, he argued, it would be necessary to invent it, because only a large, multi-ethnic state could protect small Slavic nations from being swallowed by Germany or Russia. But the empire needed to be reformed fundamentally to accommodate the national aspirations of its peoples. In Italy, the revolution was insurrectionary. Milan rose against its Austrian garrison in the famous 5 Days of March, driving the Austrian army out of the city through ferocious street fighting that turned every neighborhood into a battlefield. Venice declared itself an independent republic under the leadership of Daniele Mania. The Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont, sensing an opportunity to expel Austria from Italy entirely, declared war. The Habsburg position in the Italian peninsula, maintained for over a century, seemed on the verge of total collapse. The emperor at the center of this maelstrom was Ferdinand I, a man whose limitations were so severe that they bordered on the tragic. Ferdinand suffered from epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and possibly other neurological conditions that made him unfit for the demands of governance even in peaceful times. He was kind, gentle, and by all accounts personally likable, but he was incapable of making the decisive judgments that his empire now required. His most famous recorded utterance, delivered when told that the revolutionaries in Vienna were demanding change, was, "But are they allowed to do that?" It was a question that revealed not stupidity but a genuine bewilderment. The confusion of a man who had been told his entire life that the order he represented was permanent and God-given, confronted suddenly with evidence that it was neither. The real power behind the throne during the crisis of 1848 lay with a small circle of conservative advisors, military commanders, and members of the imperial family. The most important of these was Archduchess Sophie, Ferdinand's sister-in-law, and a Bavarian princess of formidable intelligence and iron will who had long recognized that Ferdinand was incapable of saving the dynasty. Sophie had a plan. Her 18-year-old son, Franz Joseph, would replace Ferdinand on the throne. He was young, healthy, reasonably intelligent, and untainted by the compromises and concessions that the revolutionary crisis had forced upon his uncle. A new emperor could repudiate the promises that the old emperor had been compelled to make. A new reign could begin with a clean slate, but first the empire had to survive long enough for the transition to take place. And in the summer of 1848, survival was far from certain. The turning point came not from Vienna, but from the periphery, from the empire's military commanders, who proved more capable than its politicians. In Italy, the elderly field marshal Joseph Radetzky, who was 82 years old and had been in military service since the reign of Maria Theresa's son Joseph II, rallied the Austrian forces and defeated the Sardinian army at the Battle of Custoza in July 1848. Radetzky was one of those improbable figures who seemed to belong more to fiction than to history, an octogenarian commander who slept on straw, ate the same rations as his soldiers, and displayed a tactical energy that men half his age could not match. His victory at Custoza stabilized the Italian front and gave the Habsburg court a crucial breathing space. In Prague, the military solution was even swifter. Prince Alfred Windischgratz, the Austrian military commander in Bohemia, bombarded Prague into submission in June 1848, ending the Pan-Slav Congress and the Czech revolutionary movement in a single brutal stroke. Windischgratz's wife had been killed by a stray bullet during the initial unrest in Prague, an event that, whatever its effect on his grief, certainly eliminated any inclination he might have had toward compromise. With Italy stabilized and Bohemia suppressed, the dynasty moved against Vienna itself. In October 1848, Windischgratz marched on the imperial capital with a combined Austrian and Croatian force. The Viennese revolutionaries, who had grown increasingly radical over the summer, attempted to defend the city but were overwhelmed. The revolution in Vienna was crushed by the end of the month. Among the casualties was Robert Blum, a German liberal politician who had come to Vienna to express solidarity with the revolution, and who was court-martialed and shot despite his parliamentary immunity, a deliberate signal from the Habsburg military that the time for political niceties had passed. On December 2, 1848, Ferdinand I abdicated in favor of his nephew. The ceremony took place at the Archbishop's Palace in Olmütz, a provincial Moravian city chosen precisely because it was far from revolutionary Vienna. Ferdinand, who reportedly understood what was happening only imperfectly, turned to his nephew and said with characteristic gentleness, "God bless you. Be brave." It was done gladly. Then he shuffled out of the room and into retirement, eventually settling in Prague, where he lived quietly for another 27 years, tending his garden and collecting botanical specimens, apparently happier as a private citizen than he had ever been as an emperor. Franz Joseph was 18 years old. He would reign for 68 years, longer than any other Habsburg, and he would preside over the empire's Indian Summer, its last long period of stability before the final catastrophe. But first he had to deal with Hungary. The Hungarian Revolution had not been crushed with Prague or Vienna. Unlike the urban revolts in those cities, which could be suppressed by a single decisive military action, the Hungarian Revolution had transformed into a full-scale war of independence. Kossuth and the Hungarian parliament, refusing to recognize the legality of Ferdinand's abdication or Franz Joseph's accession, declared that Hungary was an independent sovereign state. A Hungarian national army, hastily assembled but fighting with the desperate courage of men defending their homeland, won a series of surprising victories against Austrian forces in the spring of 1849, driving them out of most of Hungary and threatening to establish independence as a permanent reality. Franz Joseph, barely settled on his throne, was forced to make a decision that revealed both the empire's fundamental weakness and the lengths to which the dynasty would go to preserve itself. He asked for help from Russia. Tsar Nicholas I, who regarded himself as the guardian of conservative order in Europe and who feared that a successful Hungarian revolution might inspire similar movements among Russia's own subject peoples, agreed immediately. In June 1849, a Russian army of nearly 200,000 men crossed the Carpathian Mountains into Hungary. The Hungarian forces, already stretched to their limits fighting the Austrians, now faced an enemy they could not hope to defeat. Caught between Austrian armies advancing from the west and Russian armies descending from the north and east, the Hungarian Revolution was systematically destroyed over the course of the summer. Kossuth fled into exile in the Ottoman Empire, eventually making his way to England and then the United States, where he was received as a hero of liberty, a bitter irony for the Habsburg court, which regarded him as a traitor. The Hungarian generals who could not escape were less fortunate. On October 6th, 1849, 13 Hungarian generals were executed at the fortress of Arad, some by hanging, some by firing squad. The executions were carried out with deliberate severity. The Austrian commander, General Julius von Haynau, who earned the nickname the Hyena of Brescia for his brutal suppression of Italian resistance, was determined to make an example that Hungary would not forget. Hungary did not forget. The executions at Arad became a foundational trauma of Hungarian national memory, a wound that poisoned relations between Hungary and the Habsburg crown for the remainder of the empire's existence. October 6th is still commemorated in Hungary today. The bitterness ran so deep that, according to popular tradition, Hungarians refused to clink their beer glasses for 150 years after the executions, because the Austrian officers had reportedly clinked their glasses in celebration after the generals were killed. Neither Franz Joseph had saved his empire. He had done so at a cost that would take decades to fully comprehend. The 1850s were the decade of neo-absolutism, Franz Joseph's attempt to govern the empire as a centralized, authoritarian state, bypassing the constitutions and concessions that had been wrung from the dynasty during the revolutionary crisis. Alexander von Bock, the interior minister who gave his name to the era, implemented a system of bureaucratic centralization that imposed German-speaking administrators on every corner of the empire, suppressed the political aspirations of non-German nationalities, and attempted to create a uniform imperial identity by sheer administrative force. It did not work. It could not work. The empire was too diverse, its peoples too conscious of their distinct identities, their grievances too deeply felt. The Hungarians, in particular, practiced a policy of passive resistance that made the country effectively ungovernable from Vienna. They boycotted imperial institutions. They refused to cooperate with Bock's administrators. They maintained their own cultural and intellectual life in defiance of censorship. They waited. They were very good at waiting. They had learned patience from the Habsburgs themselves. The system's failure became undeniable in 1859, when the Habsburg Empire blundered into a war with France and Sardinia-Piedmont that resulted in the loss of Lombardy. The Battle of Solferino, fought on June 24, 1859, was so bloody Over 30,000 casualties on both sides in a single day, that a Swiss businessman named Henry Dunant, who witnessed the aftermath, was moved to found the International Red Cross. The Austrian defeat exposed the hollowness of neo-absolutism. A system that could not win wars could not justify its existence, especially when the wars it lost were fought to maintain territories whose populations did not want to be governed by Vienna. Franz Joseph, to his credit, recognized the failure. He dismissed Bach. He began slowly and reluctantly to explore constitutional alternatives. Over the next several years, the empire experimented with various constitutional frameworks. The October Diploma of 1860, the February Patent of 1861, each attempting to find a balance between central authority and provincial autonomy, between the dynasty's desire for control and the nationality's demand for recognition. None of these experiments satisfied anyone completely, but they pointed toward a solution that had been implicit in the empire's structure all along, the idea that the Habsburg domains could not be governed as a single state with a single set of rules imposed from a single center. The empire needed to become something more flexible, more responsive, more willing to accommodate the diversity that was not its weakness, but its defining characteristic. The catalyst for the final transformation was, once again, a military defeat. In 1866, Prussia, under Otto von Bismarck, provoked a war with Austria over the question of who would dominate the German-speaking world. The war lasted 7 weeks. At the Battle of Königgrätz on July 3, 1866, the Prussian army, equipped with breech-loading needle guns that could fire 5 times faster than the Austrian muzzle-loaders, annihilated the Austrian forces in a single devastating engagement. Nearly 44,000 Austrian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in a day. Königgrätz was the Battle of Mohács of the 19th century, a single afternoon that reshaped the political geography of Central Europe. Austria was expelled from the German Confederation. Bismarck's Prussia would go on to unify the German states under Prussian leadership, creating the German Empire in 1871. The Habsburgs, who had held the imperial title in the German-speaking world for centuries, who had dreamed of leading a unified Germany, were now permanently excluded from German affairs. The empire's identity as a German power, the identity it had held since Rudolph's election in 1273, was over. Franz Joseph, twice defeated in 7 years, twice stripped of territories and prestige, finally accepted what wiser observers had been telling him for a generation. The empire could not survive without fundamental restructuring, and the most urgent demand for restructuring came from Hungary. The Compromise of 1867, the Ausgleich, was the deal that saved the Habsburg Empire and defined its final half-century. Negotiated primarily between Franz Joseph and the Hungarian statesman Ferenc Deák, it transformed the empire into a dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary. The arrangement was, even by Habsburg standards, extraordinarily complex. Hungary received its own parliament, its own government, its own laws, and effective sovereignty over its internal affairs. Austria retained similar authority over its own territories. The two halves shared a common monarch, Franz Joseph, who was Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary simultaneously. A common foreign policy, a common military, and a common finance ministry to fund the shared institutions. Everything else was separate. The Ausgleich was a masterpiece of political engineering and a monument to creative ambiguity. It gave the Hungarians most of what they had demanded in 1848, self-governance, national recognition, institutional independence, without formally dissolving the empire. It preserved the Habsburg dynasty's position as the sovereign authority over a vast Central European domain. It created a framework flexible enough to accommodate two dominant nationalities while maintaining the military and diplomatic unity that great power status required. It also contained a fatal flaw. The compromise addressed the demands of the two dominant nationalities, Germans and Hungarians, and ignored everyone else. The Czechs, who had their own ancient kingdom and their own national consciousness, received nothing comparable to what Hungary had gained. The Poles, The Croats, the Romanians, the Slovaks, the Serbs, the Slavons, the Ruthenians, all were subsumed within one half or the other of the dual monarchy, their national aspirations subordinated to the interests of the dominant nationality in their respective half. In the Austrian half, the Germans dominated, though the Czechs in Bohemia and the Poles in Galicia managed to carve out significant degrees of autonomy through persistent political pressure. In the Hungarian half, the Hungarians dominated with far less tolerance, pursuing an aggressive policy of Magyarization, the imposition of Hungarian language and culture on non-Hungarian populations that alienated Slovaks, Romanians, Croats, and Serbs and stored up resentments that would explode in the 20th century. The Ausgleich, in other words, solved the Hungarian problem by creating half a dozen new national problems. It stabilized the empire in the short term by sacrificing its long-term viability. It bought the Habsburgs 50 more years of existence at the price of making their eventual dissolution all but inevitable. And yet those 50 years were not empty. They were, in many ways, the Habsburg Empire's golden age, or at least its golden twilight. Vienna in the late 19th century became one of the great cultural capitals of the world, a city whose creative output in art, music, architecture, literature, philosophy, psychology, and science was so extraordinary that it continues to shape the modern world in ways that most people never recognize. The Ringstrasse, the grand boulevard that replaced Vienna's medieval fortifications in the 1860s and 1870s, was lined with monumental buildings in every historical style. Neo-Gothic for the votive Kirche, Neo-Renaissance for the university, Neo-Classical for the parliament, Neo-Baroque for the Burg Theater. It was an exercise in architectural eclecticism that critics derided as pastiche, but that expressed more honestly than its designers perhaps intended the essence of the Habsburg Empire, a state that had no single national style, because it had no single nation. The Ringstrasse was every style and no style, a magnificent avenue of borrowed grandeur that somehow cohered into something original. The musicians who filled Vienna's concert halls and opera houses, Brahms, Bruckner, Mahler, and eventually Schoenberg, created works of such emotional depth and structural complexity that they seemed to contain the empire's contradictions within their very forms. Gustav Mahler, a Bohemian Jew who converted to Catholicism to become director of the Vienna Court Opera, embodied the empire's cultural possibilities and its social limitations in a single biography. He was, as he reportedly said, thrice homeless, as a Bohemian among Austrians, as an Austrian among Germans, and as a Jew among all the peoples of the world. The intellectuals who gathered in Vienna's coffee houses, and the coffee house itself, an institution that owed its existence to those sacks of beans left behind after the 1683 siege, were producing ideas that would reshape human self-understanding. Sigmund Freud, working in his consulting room at Berggasse 19, was developing the theories of psychoanalysis that would transform the way the Western world thought about consciousness, desire, and the hidden architecture of the human mind. Ludwig Boltzmann was revolutionizing physics. Theodor Herzl, a Budapest-born journalist covering the Dreyfus Affair in Paris, was formulating the political philosophy of Zionism. Ludwig Wittgenstein was growing up in one of the city's wealthiest families, preparing for a philosophical career that would reshape the foundations of logic and language. Ernst Mach, Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, Arthur Schnitzler, and Karl Kraus. The list of world historical figures who emerged from late Habsburg Vienna is so long and so diverse that it seems disproportionate to the modest geographic space that produced them. This extraordinary cultural flowering was not incidental to the empire's political structure. It was in significant part a product of it. The multi-ethnic, multilinguistic character of the Habsburg domains created a population that was accustomed to navigating between cultures, translating between languages, and managing the cognitive complexity that came from living in a state where identity was always multiple and never simple. The tension between tradition and modernity, between the dynasty's conservatism and the society's restless creativity, between the empire's political stagnation and its intellectual dynamism, It generated a friction that was uncomfortable to live within but extraordinarily productive of original thought. It also generated a countercurrent of darkness. Vienna's cultural brilliance existed alongside a virulent strain of popular anti-Semitism that would metastasize decades later into something almost unimaginable. Karl Lueger, who served as mayor of Vienna from 1897 to 1910, built his political career on anti-Semitic rhetoric that fused economic resentment with ethnic hatred. A young man named Adolf Hitler, who lived in Vienna from 1908 to 1913, absorbing the city's cultural atmosphere and its political poisons in equal measure, would later credit Lueger's example as a formative influence. The empire that produced Freud and Mahler also produced the conditions that would eventually produce the Holocaust. Yet the two facts are inseparable, and any account of Habsburg Vienna that celebrates the former without acknowledging the latter is incomplete. Franz Joseph presided over this world from the Hofburg Palace with an almost geological constancy. He rose at 3:30 every morning. He worked at his desk for hours before most of his subjects were awake. He ate simply. He dressed in military uniform. He read every document that required his signature. He granted audiences with meticulous punctuality. He embodied the empire not through charisma or intellectual brilliance, but through sheer endurance, the Habsburg virtue elevated to its most extreme expression. His personal life was a catalog of tragedy that would have broken a less disciplined man. His brother Maximilian, who had been installed as Emperor of Mexico in a doomed French-backed adventure, was captured and executed by firing squad in 1867. His only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, died in a murder-suicide with his young mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, at the hunting lodge of Mayerling in 1889, a scandal that the court attempted to conceal and that historians have debated ever since. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, a beautiful and deeply unhappy woman who spent most of her marriage traveling restlessly across Europe, avoiding the suffocating rituals of the Habsburg court, was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva in 1898, stabbed through the heart with a sharpened file as she walked to a steamship. Franz Joseph absorbed each blow, mourned privately, and returned to his desk. He did not reform. He did not reimagine. He administered. He maintained. He endured. He became, in the eyes of his subjects, not so much a ruler as a natural feature of the landscape, as permanent and as inscrutable as the Alps. People who had been born under his rule would grow old and die under his rule, and their children would grow old under his rule as well. His reign seemed less like a political fact than a condition of existence, as immutable as the weather. But the empire he governed was changing beneath him in ways that his morning paperwork could not capture. The national movements that the Ausgleich had failed to satisfy were growing stronger, more organized, more articulate, and more willing to look beyond the empire for support. The Czechs in Bohemia had developed a sophisticated political culture that expressed itself through parliamentary obstruction, cultural institutions, and an increasingly assertive demand for the same kind of autonomy that Hungary enjoyed. The Czech language, which had been marginalized under centuries of German-speaking dominance, experienced a revival so comprehensive that by the late 19th century it had its own modern literature, its own scientific vocabulary, its own newspapers, and its own university. The Czech section of the Charles Ferdinand University in Prague, divided from its German counterpart in 1882 in a symbolic partition that mirrored the broader fracturing of Bohemian society along linguistic lines. Czech politicians demanded a tripartite monarchy, Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia, that would give the Czech lands the same constitutional status Hungary had received in 1867. The demand was logical, historically grounded, and politically impossible, because granting it would have opened the floodgates to similar demands from every other nationality in the empire, and would have destroyed the Ausgleich that held the entire structure together. The Hungarians, who had the most to lose from any restructuring that diluted their privileged position, blocked every attempt at reform with implacable determination. The Ausgleich gave Hungary an effective veto over constitutional changes affecting the empire as a whole, and the Hungarian political elite used that veto to prevent any concession to Slavic national aspirations that might have stabilized the empire in the long run. It was a tragically short-sighted calculation. By protecting their own position within the existing framework, the Hungarians ensured that the framework itself would eventually collapse, taking their position with it. In the South Slav lands of Croatia, Bosnia, and the borderlands, where the empire met the Ottoman successor states, a different and ultimately more dangerous dynamic was at work. The Kingdom of Serbia, which had gained full independence from the Ottoman Empire at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, was developing into a magnet for South Slav nationalism. Serbian politicians and intellectuals dreamed of a greater Serbia that would unite all South Slavic peoples, Serbs, Croats, Slovens, Bosnians, under Serbian leadership. This dream placed Serbia on a direct collision course with Austria-Hungary, which governed millions of South Slavs and had no intention of releasing them. The collision point was Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Ottoman province had been occupied and administered by Austria-Hungary since 1878, under a mandate from the Congress of Berlin, though it technically remained under Ottoman sovereignty. In 1908, in a move that stunned Europe and infuriated Serbia, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, converting the occupation into permanent possession. The annexation was the brainchild of Foreign Minister Alois Lexa von Aehrenthal, who believed that decisive action would strengthen the empire's position in the Balkans and demonstrate that Austria-Hungary was still capable of great power assertiveness. The effect was precisely the opposite. Serbia, backed by Russia, denounced the annexation as an act of imperial theft. Pan-Slavic sentiment, already running high, intensified throughout the Balkans and within the empire's own South Slav populations. Secret societies dedicated to the liberation of Bosnia from Habsburg rule proliferated. The Black Hand, a Serbian military intelligence organization committed to South Slav unification through any means necessary, began recruiting agents and planning operations within Habsburg territory. The annexation crisis of 1908 was resolved diplomatically. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, Russia was forced to back down. But the underlying tensions were not resolved. They were compressed, like a spring being wound tighter and tighter, storing energy that would eventually be released with catastrophic force. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 wound the spring further. Serbia emerged from those conflicts doubled in size, militarily confident, and more determined than ever to challenge Habsburg dominance over the South Slavs. Austria-Hungary's chief of staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, advocated preventive war against Serbia with a persistence that bordered on obsession. He proposed it more than 25 times between 1906 and 1914, according to some counts, and was overruled each time by Franz Joseph and the civilian leadership. Conrad believed that the empire was slowly dying, that its internal contradictions were eroding its strength year by year, and that only a victorious war could restore its vitality and cohesion. He was not entirely wrong in his diagnosis. His prescription, however, would prove fatal. The man who stood between the empire and catastrophe, or rather, who might have stood between the empire and catastrophe had he lived, was Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was not an obvious savior. He was difficult, stubborn, frequently unpleasant, and possessed of a temper so volcanic that even senior officials dreaded his outbursts. He was obsessed with hunting to a degree that struck even his contemporaries as excessive. His personal game records, meticulously maintained, document the killing of nearly 300,000 animals over his lifetime, including approximately 5,000 deer, a figure so staggering that it suggests not recreation but compulsion. He was suspicious of Hungarians, contemptuous of the Italian irredentists who wanted to detach the empire's Italian-speaking territories, and impatient with the Byzantine complexity of Habsburg politics. But Franz Ferdinand possessed one quality that the empire desperately needed, and that almost no one else in the ruling circle shared. He understood that the empire could not survive in its current form. He recognized that the Ausgleich was a dead end, that the dual structure privileged two nationalities at the expense of all others, and that the empire needed to evolve into something more inclusive if it was to survive the pressures of the 20th century. His vision, never fully articulated because he died before he could implement it, was some form of federalism that would give the Slavic peoples of the empire a genuine voice in governance. The details were vague. The concept was known as trialism in some formulations, envisioning a triple monarchy that added a South Slav component to the Austrian-Hungarian dyad. Now, in other versions, it was a more radical decentralization that would have transformed the empire into a federation of autonomous national units. Whatever its precise shape, Franz Ferdinand's vision terrified precisely the people who should have been its natural supporters. The Serbian nationalists who wanted to unite the South Slavs under Serbian leadership recognized that a reformed Habsburg empire, one that genuinely accommodated Slavic aspirations, would be a far more formidable obstacle to their ambitions than the dysfunctional dual monarchy they currently confronted. A Habsburg empire that gave its South Slav subjects genuine self-governance would eliminate the grievances that made pan-Serbian nationalism attractive. It would drain the revolution of its oxygen. It would make the empire work. This was why Franz Ferdinand had to die. Not because he was the oppressor of the South Slavs, but because he threatened to become their benefactor. His assassination was not an act of desperation against tyranny. It was an act of preemption against reform. Franz Ferdinand's personal life contained its own Habsburg drama. He had fallen in love with Countess Sophie Chotek, a woman of noble but insufficiently royal blood. The Habsburg house laws, which regulated marriage with the obsessive precision of a breeding registry, dictated that the heir to the throne could only marry a member of a reigning or formerly reigning European dynasty. Sophie, though an aristocrat by any reasonable standard, did not meet this requirement. Franz Ferdinand's determination to marry her anyway provoked a family crisis that dragged on for years. Franz Joseph, who had endured his own share of marital unhappiness, eventually permitted the marriage on the condition that it be morganatic, meaning that Sophie could never share her husband's rank, could never sit beside him at official functions, and that their children could never inherit the throne. Franz Ferdinand accepted these humiliating conditions because the alternative was to renounce Sophie, and this he would not do. The morganatic marriage became, for Franz Ferdinand, a source of perpetual irritation and occasional rage. At official Habsburg events, Sophie was seated far from her husband behind archduchesses of lesser significance and less ability. She could not ride with him in the imperial carriage. She was snubbed by the very court whose future she was supposed to share. Franz Ferdinand seethed at every slight. And his resentment toward the rigid protocol of the Habsburg court deepened into a bitterness that colored his entire political outlook. There was, however, one exception to the rules that governed Sophie's status. When Franz Ferdinand was acting in his military capacity, when he was inspecting troops, reviewing exercises, or performing other functions as the empire's inspector general of the armed forces, Sophie could appear beside him as his consort with full honors without the degrading distinctions that shadowed her everywhere else. This was why Franz Ferdinand accepted the invitation to observe military maneuvers in Bosnia in June 1914. And this was why Sophie was sitting beside him in the open car when it turned onto Franz Josef Street in Sarajevo on the morning of June 28th, and slowed, and stopped. 5 feet from where Gavrilo Princip was standing. The assassination had been organized by the Black Hand, working through a cell of young Bosnian Serbs recruited for their willingness to die. The conspirators were armed with pistols and bombs supplied through Serbian military intelligence channels. They were positioned along the Archduke's publicly announced route, a security arrangement so negligent that it beggars belief. The Sarajevo police force consisted of roughly 120 officers for a city that, on the day of the visit, was filled with hostile political undercurrents and known security threats. The military governor of Bosnia had requested additional troops for the visit and been refused on grounds of expense. The Archduke's motorcade had no military escort. You remember the route was lined with crowds who had not been searched, standing behind no barriers on streets that were not closed to traffic. When the first assassin, Nedeljko Čebrinović, threw his bomb at the motorcade and missed, the reasonable response would have been to abandon the visit, rush the Archduke to safety, and lock down the city. Instead, Franz Ferdinand was driven to the town hall, where he delivered a furious impromptu speech. "So you welcome your guests with bombs?" Attended a brief reception, and was then driven back through the city on a route that was supposed to have been changed but was not communicated to the driver. The driver, following the original route, turned onto Franz Josef Street. A member of the Archduke's staff, realizing the error, ordered the driver to stop and reverse. The car stalled. And there was Princip. The aftermath of the assassination revealed the Habsburg Empire at its worst, an indecisive, internally divided, and fatally dependent on an alliance system that transformed a regional crisis into a continental catastrophe. Franz Josef, who was 83 years old, and had received the news of his nephew's death with the chilling composure of a man who had already absorbed more grief than any human being should have to bear, reportedly murmured that it was the will of God and that the Almighty could not be defied. Some accounts suggest that Franz Josef's private reaction was more complex, that he was quietly relieved that an heir whose political views he distrusted and whose morganatic marriage he had always resented was no longer a problem. If this was true, it was the most catastrophic relief in the history of human emotion. The Habsburg government spent the next month, the so-called July crisis, trying to decide what to do. The War Party, led by Konrad von Hötzendorf and supported by Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, wanted to use the assassination as a pretext for the preventive war against Serbia that Konrad had been advocating for nearly a decade. The Peace Party, smaller and less influential, warned that a war against Serbia would inevitably draw in Russia, Serbia's great power patron, and that Russian involvement would trigger the alliance systems that linked Russia to France and Austria-Hungary to Germany, producing a general European war that no one could control and no one could win. The War Party prevailed, not because its arguments were stronger, but because the logic of the alliance system had created a situation in which inaction seemed more dangerous than action. Germany, Austria, Hungary's only reliable ally, provided what historians have called the blank check, an assurance that Germany would support whatever response Austria-Hungary chose, including military action against Serbia, regardless of the consequences. The blank check was not a German plot to start a world war. It was a German miscalculation of the first order, based on the assumption that Austria-Hungary could crush Serbia quickly, before Russia had time to mobilize, and that the crisis could be localized to the Balkans. On July 23rd, nearly a month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia containing demands so extreme that they were designed to be rejected. Serbia, under intense pressure from Russia and France, accepted almost all of the demands, but not quite all. Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28th. Russia began mobilizing. Germany, committed to supporting Austria-Hungary and facing the prospect of a two-front war against Russia and France, activated its own war plan. France, bound by alliance to Russia, mobilized in turn. Germany invaded Belgium to outflank the French defenses, which brought Britain into the war. Within a week, the major powers of Europe were at war with each other. The Habsburg Empire entered the First World War with an army that was brave, experienced, and profoundly unprepared for the conflict it was about to face. The Austro-Hungarian military was a multi-ethnic institution that reflected the empire's diversity in both its strengths and its weaknesses. EU officers were required to speak German, but enlisted men spoke a dozen different languages, and communication problems on the battlefield were chronic and sometimes fatal. The army's equipment was adequate but not cutting edge. Its officer corps was professional but rigid, trained in the doctrines of the 19th century and slow to adapt to the realities of 20th century industrial warfare. Konrad von Hötzendorf, who had agitated for war for so long, proved far better at advocating for conflict than at conducting it. His opening campaigns against Serbia and Russia were disasters. The invasion of Serbia, which was supposed to be a quick punitive expedition, turned into a humiliating fiasco. The Serbian army, smaller but fighting on its own terrain with the fury of a nation defending its existence, threw back the Austrian offensives and even launched counterattacks that briefly carried Serbian forces onto Habsburg territory. It was not until 1915, when Germany and Bulgaria joined the campaign, that Serbia was finally overwhelmed. And even then, the Serbian army conducted an epic fighting retreat through the Albanian mountains to the Adriatic coast, a tragedy of almost unimaginable suffering that killed tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. On the Eastern Front, the picture was equally grim. The initial Austrian offensive into Russian Poland was repulsed with enormous losses. The Russian counteroffensive into Galicia, the Habsburg province that encompassed much of modern-day western Ukraine and southern Poland, was a catastrophe. The fortress of Przemysl, one of the largest military fortifications in Europe, was besieged and eventually captured by the Russians in March 1915, along with over 100,000 Austrian prisoners. The total Austro-Hungarian casualties in the first year of the war, killed, wounded, captured, and missing, exceeded 2 million men. The pre-war professional army, the institutional backbone of the military, was effectively destroyed. It would be replaced by conscripts whose training was hasty and whose loyalty to the multinational empire was far less certain than that of the regulars they replaced. The war exposed every weakness the empire possessed. The national tensions that the Ausgleich had papered over began to reassert themselves under the pressure of military defeat, economic hardship, and mounting casualties. Czech soldiers fighting in an Austrian uniform against fellow Slavs in the Russian army deserted in significant numbers. Some formed volunteer units that fought alongside the Russians against their own empire. The Czech political leadership, initially loyal, gradually shifted toward the position that the empire could not be reformed and must be replaced by independent national states. Tomáš Masaryk, a Czech philosopher and politician who had spent decades advocating for reform within the Habsburg framework, left the empire in 1914 and began organizing an international campaign for Czech independence. Similar movements gained strength among the empire's other nationalities. South Slav politicians began planning for a post-Habsburg state that would unite Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Romanian nationalists looked toward union with the Kingdom of Romania, which entered the war on the Allied side in 1916, partly in the hope of annexing Transylvania. Polish leaders maneuvered between the warring empires, seeking the best deal for an eventual Polish state. The centrifugal forces that had been building for decades were now being accelerated by the war's destruction of the institutions the army, the bureaucracy, the economic system to one that had held the empire together. Franz Joseph did not live to see the full dimensions of the disaster. He died on November 21, 1916, at the age of 86 in his iron bed at the Schönbrunn Palace, attended by his valet and a few members of the imperial household. He had been emperor for 68 years. He had outlived his wife, his son, his brother, and his nephew. He had seen his empire survive revolution, military defeat, and constitutional crisis. He had witnessed the birth of the modern world from behind the desk where he had sat every morning since the age of 18, reading reports, signing documents, maintaining the routine that was the closest thing to meaning his life contained. His death removed the one figure whose personal authority had transcended the empire's institutional failures. Franz Joseph had not solved any of the empire's problems. He had not reformed its political structure or reconciled its nationalities or modernized its military, but he had embodied the empire in a way that no institution or constitution could replicate. He was the empire, his face on the coins, his portrait in the offices, nor his name on the buildings. These were not merely symbols of authority, but the connective tissue that held a disparate collection of peoples together in the absence of any other common identity. With his death, that tissue began to dissolve. His successor was his grandnephew Karl, a 29-year-old officer who was both more sympathetic and more hopeless than any Habsburg who had preceded him. Karl was intelligent, genuinely compassionate, and deeply aware that the empire could not survive the war in its present form. He attempted, almost from the moment of his accession, to find a way out. He secretly contacted the Allied powers through his brother-in-law, Prince Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, offering to negotiate a separate peace. The Sixtus affair, as it became known when the French eventually made it public, out of proposed territorial concessions and diplomatic realignments that might have extracted Austria-Hungary from the war while preserving the empire as a functioning entity. The negotiations failed. They failed because the Allied powers by 1917 had committed themselves to the principle of national self-determination, the idea that the empire's subject peoples had the right to choose their own political destinies. They failed because Germany, Austria, Hungary's ally and increasingly its master, would not countenance a separate peace that left it fighting alone. They failed because Karl's own ministers, when they learned of the secret contacts, were horrified by what they regarded as a betrayal of the alliance. And they failed because the Sixtus letters, when they were revealed by the French Premier Georges Clemenceau in April 1918. I humiliated Karl personally and destroyed whatever remained of his credibility as a wartime leader. Karl was the last emperor. He knew it, though he could not admit it. The empire he had inherited was already dying by the time he received it, and nothing he could have done, no reform, no peace offer, no constitutional innovation could have saved it, because the forces that were destroying it had been building for a century and had now been given irresistible momentum by the war. The final collapse, when it came, was not the violent cataclysm that the word collapse might suggest. It was something quieter, more diffuse, more like an evaporation than an explosion. Throughout the autumn of 1918, as the military situation deteriorated on every front, the empire's constituent peoples simply began to leave. On October 6, 1918, a national council of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes declared its intention to form an independent South Slav state. On October 28th, the Czechoslovak National Council in Prague proclaimed the independence of Czechoslovakia. On October 31st, Hungary severed its constitutional ties to Austria. On November 1st, the Ukrainians of Eastern Galicia declared their own state. The Romanians of Transylvania voted for union with Romania. The Poles of Galicia joined the newly reconstituted Polish Republic. Each departure was a thread pulled from a fabric that had already worn thin, and each one made the remaining structure weaker, more transparent, until what was left was not an empire at all, but a name attached to nothing. The armies dissolved along the same national lines. Czech regiments simply walked away from the front and marched home. Hungarian units did the same. Croatian soldiers abandoned their positions in Italy and headed south. The Austro-Hungarian military, which had held together through 4 years of industrial slaughter with a cohesion that surprised even its critics, came apart in the final weeks not through defeat in battle but through the evaporation of the idea that had justified its existence. Men who had fought and died together for years discovered in the autumn of 1918 that they had been fighting for something that no longer existed and perhaps had never existed in the form they had imagined. The Italian front, which had been the most stable of Austria-Hungary's battlefields for much of the war, provided the final military humiliation. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto, launched by the Italians on October 24, 1918, encountered an army that was already disintegrating. Entire divisions refused to fight, others surrendered en masse. The Italians advanced with an ease that bore no relation to the bloody stalemates of the previous 3 years, not because they had suddenly become superior soldiers, but because the army opposing them had ceased to function as an organized force. By the time the armistice was signed on November 3rd, over 300,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers had been taken prisoner in barely 10 days. Many of them had surrendered willingly, even eagerly, seeing captivity as preferable to continuing to serve an empire that had already ceased to claim their allegiance. Karl watched the dissolution from Vienna with a helplessness that was total and genuine. He was not a tyrant, clinging to power. He was not a despot refusing to read the writing on the wall. He was a young man of moderate abilities and sincere good intentions who had been handed an impossible situation and lacked the ruthlessness, the cynicism, or the genius necessary to alter its outcome. He explored every option. He issued a manifesto on October 16th offering to transform the Austrian half of the empire into a federal union of autonomous national states. Precisely the kind of reform that might have saved the empire had it been proposed 20 years earlier. In October 1918, it was received with the indifference one might show to a fire extinguisher offered after the building has already burned to the ground. The manifesto's failure illustrated the cruelest irony of the empire's final chapter. The reforms that could have saved it were always proposed too late, after the moment of maximum leverage had passed, after the people who might have accepted them had already committed themselves to alternatives. The Habsburgs' characteristic patience, the quality that had served them so magnificently during their rise, became a fatal liability during their fall. They waited when they should have acted. They deliberated when they should have decided. They offered concessions when the time for concessions had expired, and only transformation would suffice. The streets of Vienna in early November 1918 presented a spectacle that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had walked them a decade earlier. The imperial capital, which had functioned for centuries as the administrative and symbolic heart of a vast multi-ethnic state, it was suddenly the capital of nothing. Soldiers in ragged uniforms, many of them wounded, wandered through the streets in a daze, unsure of what country they now belonged to or what authority, if any, they owed obedience. Food was scarce. Coal was scarcer. The influenza pandemic that was sweeping the world had reached Vienna, and the hospitals, already overwhelmed by war casualties, could not cope with the new surge of sick and dying. The Baroque facades of the inner city, the monuments to Habsburg grandeur that lined the Ringstrasse, looked down on a population that was cold, hungry, frightened, and leaderless. On November 11, 1918, the same day that the armistice ended the fighting on the Western Front, Karl signed a document that has been the subject of careful parsing ever since. It was not technically an abdication. Karl never used that word. What he signed was a declaration that he renounced every participation in the administration of the state and acknowledged in advance whatever form of government the new Austria might adopt. It was a distinction without a practical difference. Karl was surrendering power as completely as if he had abdicated, but the careful wording reflected the Habsburg instinct for preserving legal options. By not formally abdicating, Karl maintained the theoretical possibility that the monarchy could be restored. He was, even in the moment of its extinction, keeping the dynasty's claim alive. The ceremony, if it could be called that, took place in the blue Chinese salon of the Schönbrunn Palace. The room was small, intimate, decorated in the chinoiserie style that had been fashionable in the 18th century. Karl sat at a desk. His wife, Empress Zita, stood beside him, her face set in an expression of controlled fury. Zita, a Bourbon princess of fierce dynastic pride, had opposed the renunciation with every fiber of her being. She had argued, pleaded, and raged against it. When Karl picked up the pen to sign, Zita is said to have spoken the words that would define her character for the remainder of her long life. "A sovereign can never abdicate, she told him. He can be deposed, he can be forced to leave, but abdicate, never, never, never." Karl signed. The small group of ministers and officials who had assembled to witness the act stood in silence. No one cheered, no one wept, at least not openly. The moment had the quality of a medical procedure, necessary, painful, conducted with as little drama as the circumstances allowed. 640 years of Habsburg rule in the German-speaking lands ended not with a revolution or a battle, but with a signature in a small room on a cold November afternoon. The following day, November 12, 1918, the Provisional National Assembly of German Austria proclaimed a republic. The crowds that gathered before the Parliament building on the Ringstrasse were large but subdued. There was no storming of palaces, no guillotines, no revolutionary tribunals. The Habsburgs were not dragged from their residence and executed as the Romanovs had been in Russia 5 months earlier. They were not imprisoned. They were, in a sense, simply asked to leave. Karl and his family departed Schönbrunn on November 13th. The imperial household made its way by car to the Eckartsau hunting lodge in the Marchfeld, the same flat plain northeast of Vienna where Rudolf of Habsburg had defeated Ottokar of Bohemia in 1278 and established the dynasty's hold on Austria. It was a coincidence that no one remarked upon at the time, but that carries a symmetry almost too neat for history. The dynasty's story in Austria had begun on the Marchfeld, and it ended on the Marchfeld 6.5 centuries later in the same landscape, under an equally uncertain sky. The family remained at Eckartsau through the winter and into the spring, living in increasingly reduced circumstances. The new Republican government was uncertain what to do with them. There was no appetite for violence. Austria's revolution was remarkably bloodless compared to those in Russia or Germany. But there was equally no appetite for maintaining an ex-emperor in comfort at public expense while the population starved. The British government, acting through a military liaison officer named Lieutenant Colonel Edward Lysel Strutt, eventually arranged for the imperial family's departure. In March 1919, Karl, Zita, and their children boarded a train and left Austria for Switzerland, beginning an exile that would last for most of them the rest of their lives. Karl did not go quietly into the historical shadows. Twice, in 1921, he attempted to reclaim the throne of Hungary, where he retained significant support among monarchist factions. Both attempts, known as the Easter Crisis and the Second Royal Coup, were fiascos that ended in Karl's arrest and deportation. The Hungarian regent, Admiral Miklós Horthy, who had initially been installed as a caretaker for the absent king, proved unwilling to surrender the power he had acquired. The Allied powers, particularly the successor states of Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, threatened war if Karl were restored. Hungary's neighbors had not fought to dismantle one Habsburg empire only to watch another emerge on their borders. After the second failed restoration attempt, Karl and his family were exiled to the Portuguese island of Madeira, a remote Atlantic outpost chosen specifically for its distance from the political intrigues of Central Europe. There, in a rented villa called the Quinta do Monte, Karl fell ill with pneumonia in the spring of 1922. He had no money for adequate medical care. The villa was damp, poorly heated, and situated at an elevation that aggravated his respiratory condition. Zita nursed him with a devotion that witnesses described as both heroic and heartbreaking. Their eldest son, 10-year-old Otto, was brought to his father's bedside. Karl died on April 1st, 1922. He was 34 years old. His last words, spoken to Zita, were reported as, "I must suffer like this so that my peoples can come together." Whether the words were precisely those or whether they were shaped in the retelling by Zita's determination to preserve her husband's memory as that of a martyr is impossible to verify. What is certain is that Karl died in poverty, far from the lands he had been born to rule, in circumstances that would have seemed inconceivable to any of his ancestors. The Catholic Church eventually beatified Karl in 2004, recognizing him as Blessed Karl of Austria, a distinction based on his personal piety, his efforts to pursue peace during the war, and his acceptance of suffering. It was a gesture that would have puzzled his more worldly predecessors, but that captured something genuine about the last Habsburg emperor. He was, by all available evidence, a decent man overtaken by indecent times. Zita survived her husband by nearly 7 decades. She never remarried. She never abandoned her conviction that the abdication, or rather the renunciation, since she refused to use the word abdication, was illegitimate, and that the Habsburg claims remained legally valid. She dressed in black for the rest of her life, and a living monument to a vanished world. When she finally returned to Austria in 1982, 63 years after her departure, the visit was private and carefully negotiated. The Austrian government still feared the political implications of a Habsburg return. She died in 1989 at the age of 96 and was buried in the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin Church in Vienna, alongside 145 other members of the Habsburg dynasty. The crypt, which had served as the dynasty's burial place since 1633, received its most recent arrival 3.5 centuries after it received its first. The world that emerged from the Habsburg Empire's dissolution was not the world that any of the successor states had imagined. The peace settlement imposed by the victorious Allied powers at Saint-Germain-en-Laye and Trianon redrew the map of Central Europe with a confidence that bore no relation to the complexity of what it was attempting to reorganize. Austria was reduced to a small, landlocked republic of barely 7 million people, a head without a body. As contemporaries observed, a capital city surrounded by alpine provinces that had no economic rationale for existing as an independent state. The new Austria contained Vienna, one of the great imperial cities of the world, and almost nothing else of comparable significance. The city's population alone accounted for nearly a third of the new country's total. It was as though London had been made the capital of a nation consisting only of southeastern England. Hungary suffered even more dramatically. The Treaty of Trianon, signed in June 1920, stripped Hungary of over 2/3 of its pre-war territory and nearly 3/4 of its population. Transylvania went to Romania. Slovakia and Ruthenia went to Czechoslovakia. Croatia and parts of the southern plain went to the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens, later renamed Yugoslavia. The rump Hungarian state that remained was a fraction of the historic kingdom, and over 3 million ethnic Hungarians found themselves living as minorities in neighboring states, separated from their homeland by borders drawn in Paris by diplomats who had, in many cases, never visited the regions they were partitioning. The bitterness generated by Trianon became the defining emotion of interwar Hungarian politics, chaos, a wound so deep and so central to national identity that it has not fully healed a century later. Maps showing the borders of pre-Trianon Hungary were displayed in classrooms. School children recited the irredentist prayer Nem Nem Soha, no, no, never, pledging that the lost territories would one day be recovered. The slogan became a political program that drove Hungary into alliance with fascist Italy and Nazi Germany in the 1930s, as successive Hungarian governments sought revision of the Trianon settlement by any means available. The consequences of that choice would prove even more catastrophic than the treaty itself. Czechoslovakia, the most successful of the successor states in the immediate post-war period, was a democratic republic built on foundations that were less stable than they appeared. The partnership between Czechs and Slovaks that gave the country its name was strained from the beginning. The Slovaks, who had spent centuries under Hungarian rule rather than Austrian, had a different political culture, a different economic profile, and a different relationship to the very concept of a shared state. More dangerously, the new country included over 3 million ethnic Germans concentrated in the Sudetenland, the mountainous border regions that had been part of the Habsburg domains for centuries. These Sudeten Germans had never been consulted about their incorporation into a Czech-led state, and many of them resented it deeply. And their resentment would provide Adolf Hitler with the pretext he needed to dismember Czechoslovakia in 1938, beginning the chain of events that led to the Second World War. Yugoslavia, the South Slav state that Gavrilo Princip and his co-conspirators had dreamed of creating, proved even more fragile. The union of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was plagued from the start by the same national tensions that had afflicted the Habsburg Empire, with the additional complication that the dominant Serbs, who had fought on the winning side of the war, and who controlled the new state's military and political institutions, treated the Croats and Slovenes with a high-handedness that rekindled precisely the resentments the union was supposed to resolve. The Serb-Croat divide, which the Habsburgs had managed, imperfectly, inadequately, but managed, through the empire's complex institutional framework, became an open wound in the new state that would bleed intermittently for the rest of the century, erupting into genocide during the Second World War and into full-scale civil war during the Yugoslav breakup of the 1990s. The terrible irony of the Habsburg dissolution was that the nation-states that replaced the empire reproduced in miniature many of the same problems that had afflicted it. Every successor state contained national minorities. Every successor state faced the challenge of building a coherent political identity from ethnically diverse populations. Every successor state struggled with the tension between the dominant nationality's desire for control and the minority's demand for recognition. The difference was that the Habsburg Empire had possessed, through centuries of accumulated experience, institutional mechanisms for managing these tensions. Imperfect mechanisms, to be sure, but mechanisms nonetheless. The successor states had to build theirs from scratch, in a region traumatized by war, destabilized by economic collapse, and increasingly polarized by the competing ideological forces of fascism and communism. František Pulaski's prophecy, that if the Austrian Empire did not exist, it would be necessary to invent it, acquired a bitter resonance in the decades that followed its disappearance. The Central European order that the Habsburgs had maintained for centuries, for all its inequities and inefficiencies, had provided a framework within which diverse peoples coexisted, traded, interacted, and created. Its replacement by a collection of small, insecure, mutually hostile nation-states produced not liberation, but a new and in many ways more dangerous form of instability. An instability that 2 world wars, a genocide, 40 years of communist dictatorship, and several additional conflicts have not yet fully resolved. This is not to romanticize the Habsburg Empire or to suggest that its preservation would have prevented the catastrophes of the 20th century. The empire's failures were real. Its suppression of national aspirations was real. Its social inequalities, its political rigidity, its inability to reform itself quickly enough to satisfy the demands of its peoples, all of these were real and consequential. The empire did not fall because of a conspiracy or a single assassin's bullet. It fell because it could not solve the fundamental problem of the modern era: how to organize political life in a world where people increasingly define themselves by language and ethnicity rather than by dynastic loyalty or religious affiliation. But the question that the Habsburg experience poses, how diverse peoples can share political space without either assimilation or separation, remains the central question of European politics today. The European Union, in its attempt to create a supranational framework that accommodates national diversity within common institutions, is engaged in a project that the Habsburgs would have recognized immediately, even if its democratic foundations would have bewildered them. The tensions that roil the EU between national sovereignty and supranational governance, even between the interests of large member states and small ones, between the desire for common standards and the insistence on local autonomy, are recognizably the same tensions that the Habsburgs spent 6 centuries trying to manage. The dynasty itself did not disappear with the empire. Otto von Habsburg, Karl and Zita's eldest son, the boy who had stood at his father's deathbed in Madeira, grew into a man of remarkable intellect and political sophistication. He became a leading advocate of European integration, served in the European Parliament, and worked tirelessly to promote the idea of a united Europe that would transcend the national rivalries that had destroyed his family's empire. When the Iron Curtain fell in 1989, Otto played a symbolic role in the Pan-European picnic, a demonstration on the Austrian-Hungarian border that helped open the first breach in the barrier between East and West. The great-grandson of Franz Joseph, the grandson of the last emperor standing on the border between 2 worlds that his family's empire had once united. It was an image freighted with more historical resonance than any single photograph could contain. Otto renounced his claim to the Austrian throne in 1961, a legal prerequisite for being allowed to return to Austria, though the renunciation was made under circumstances that led some Habsburg loyalists to question its sincerity. He died in 2011 at the age of 98 and was buried in the Imperial Crypt, the last great Habsburg funeral attended by thousands. The coffin carried through the streets of Vienna to the Capuchin Church, where the traditional Habsburg burial ritual was performed one final time. At the door of the crypt, the Capuchin friar asks, as tradition requires, "Who seeks entry?" The titles are recited, all of them, the accumulated honors of 6 centuries. The friar responds, "We do not know him." The titles are repeated in abbreviated form. Again, the friar refuses. Finally, the request is made in the simplest possible terms. a mortal, sinful human being. And the door opens. It was a ritual that distilled the Habsburg story into a single exchange, the long accumulation of titles, territories, and power, the insistence of the church and of death, that none of it matters, and the final admission that what remains after all the grandeur has been stripped away is simply a human being no different from any other, seeking entry into whatever comes next. The crypt beneath the Capuchin church holds more than bodies. It holds the physical record of a dynasty's evolution. From the simple copper coffins of the 17th century to the elaborate Baroque sarcophages of Maria Theresa's era, covered in sculpted skulls and weeping angels, to the austere, almost modernist simplicity of the later interments. To walk through the crypt is to walk through the history of European aesthetics, European power, and European death, all compressed into a series of underground chambers beneath one of Vienna's quieter streets. Tourists file through in a steady stream, pausing before the double sarcophagus of Maria Theresa and Francis Stephen, which is so large and so ornate that it dominates its chamber like a Baroque altar. They photograph Franz Joseph's relatively modest coffin and the small plaque marking the resting place of his son Rudolf. They read the names and dates and move on, carrying with them a vague sense of having been in the presence of something significant, without always being able to articulate what. But the Habsburg legacy is not confined to a crypt, or to Vienna, or even to the borders of the old empire. It is woven into the fabric of modern Europe in ways that are so pervasive they have become invisible, like the foundation stones of a building that no one sees because everything else rests on top of them. Consider the legal systems of Central Europe. The Austrian General Civil Code of 1811, promulgated under Franz I during the Napoleonic Wars, it was one of the great codifications of European law. A comprehensive, systematic attempt to organize the rights and obligations of citizens into a single coherent document. It drew on the natural law tradition, on Roman legal principles, and on the practical experience of governing a multi-ethnic empire where legal consistency was not an abstract ideal but a daily administrative necessity. The code survived the empire. It remained in force in Austria, in modified form, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Its principles influenced the legal systems of every successor state. When Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and the South Slav kingdoms needed to build their own legal frameworks after 1918, they did not start from nothing. They started from the institutional infrastructure the Habsburgs had left behind, the courts. The procedures, the trained jurists, the habits of legal reasoning that centuries of Habsburg governance had cultivated. Consider the railroads. The Habsburg Empire built one of the most extensive rail networks in Europe, connecting Vienna to Prague, Budapest, Trieste, Lemberg, Krakow, and dozens of smaller cities in a web of steel and steam that transformed the economic geography of Central Europe. The railroads were built for imperial purposes, to move troops, to facilitate commerce, to bind the empire's far-flung territories into a functioning economic unit. But they outlasted the empire that built them. The rail lines that connect the capitals of modern Central Europe still follow in many cases the routes that Habsburg engineers surveyed in the 19th century. The grand terminal stations, Vienna's Südbahnhof, Budapest's Keleti, Prague's Hlavní nádraží, were built as monuments to imperial connectivity, and they continue to serve that function today, carrying passengers across borders that the Habsburgs never drew. Consider the universities. The Charles University in Prague, founded in 1348 by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV, was the first university in Central Europe. The University of Vienna, founded in 1365, was the second. The University of Krakow, the University of Budapest, the University of Graz, the University of Innsbruck. All of these institutions were founded, expanded, or reformed under Habsburg patronage, and all of them became centers of intellectual life that radiated influence far beyond the empire's borders. The scientific and philosophical traditions that emerged from these universities, the Vienna Circle's logical positivism, The Austrian school of economics, the Prague school of linguistics, the Budapest tradition of mathematics that produced John von Neumann and Paul Erdos were products of a particular intellectual environment that the Habsburg Empire's multi-ethnic, multilinguistic character had uniquely fostered. The cross-pollination of ideas that occurred when German-speaking, Czech-speaking, Hungarian-speaking, and Polish-speaking scholars shared institutions, cities, and coffee houses produced a creative ferment that no monolingual national culture could have replicated. Consider the very shape of the nations that emerged from the empire's ruins. The borders of modern Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, Slovenia, and significant portions of Poland, Romania, Ukraine, and Italy were determined not by geography or ethnicity alone, but by the administrative boundaries that the Habsburg Empire had established over centuries. Bohemia is a political entity today because it was a political entity under the Habsburgs. Croatia exists as an independent nation in part because the Habsburgs maintained it as a distinct administrative unit within the Hungarian kingdom. The border between Austria and Hungary, which seems so natural on a modern map, was drawn by the Ausgleich of 1867 and maintained through the empire's dissolution. Even the borders that were redrawn after 1918, the borders that caused so much suffering and resentment, were drawn with reference to Habsburg administrative divisions, using them as templates to be modified rather than as blank slates to be redrawn from scratch. The Habsburg influence extends into realms that seem far removed from politics and law. The coffeehouse culture that defines Vienna, Prague, Budapest, and a dozen other Central European cities is a Habsburg creation, not merely because of the legendary coffee beans left behind after the 1683 siege, but because the coffeehouse as an institution flourished in the particular social environment that the empire cultivated. The coffeehouse was a space where the empire's rigid social hierarchies could be temporarily suspended, where a Jewish intellectual could sit at the same table as a minor aristocrat, where a Czech journalist could debate a German philosopher, where the newspapers of a dozen countries were available on wooden racks and a single cup of coffee purchased the right to sit for hours. The coffeehouse was, in miniature, what the empire aspired to be at large, a space of managed coexistence where difference was acknowledged but did not preclude shared participation in a common culture. The musical traditions of Central Europe bear the Habsburg imprint so deeply that separating the two is almost impossible. The reason Vienna became the musical capital of the Western world was not an accident of geography or climate. It was a consequence of centuries of Habsburg patronage, of emperors who employed composers, funded orchestras, built opera houses, and created the institutional framework within which musical genius could flourish. Haydn served the Esterházy family and one of the great Hungarian noble houses within the Habsburg system. Mozart performed for Maria Theresa as a child and struggled for patronage in Joseph II's Vienna. Beethoven came to Vienna because it was the place where a musician of ambition had to be, and the reason it was that place was because the Habsburgs and the aristocratic culture they sustained had made it so. The tradition continued through Schubert, Brahms, Bruckner, Mahler, Strauss, Wagner, both Strausses, father and son, and into the revolutionary experiments of Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, who destroyed the tonal system that their predecessors had perfected and built something entirely new on its ruins. Even the waltz, that most Viennese of cultural forms, the dance that symbolizes the city more completely than any building or monument, was a product of the Habsburg world. The waltz emerged in the late 18th century from the folk dances of the Austrian and Bavarian countryside, was refined in the ballrooms of the Viennese aristocracy, and was transformed by Johann Strauss II into a form of such sophistication and emotional depth that it transcended its origins entirely. The Blue Danube, perhaps the most famous piece of music ever associated with a city, was composed in 1867, the same year as the Ausgleich. It is tempting and perhaps not entirely fanciful to hear in its sweeping melody and its moments of melancholy something of the empire's own character. Beauty and sadness intertwined, grandeur and fragility inseparable, a dance that moves in circles and never quite arrives at a destination. The culinary landscape of Central Europe is another map of Habsburg influence, though one that is rarely read in those terms. The Viennese schnitzel, the Sachertorte, the Apfelstrudel. These are dishes that tourists consume as emblems of Austrian national identity, without recognizing that they are products of an empire, not a nation. The schnitzel's origins are disputed. Some trace it to Milan, others to Constantinople, but its perfection was achieved in Viennese kitchens that drew ingredients and techniques from across the empire. The strudel dough, pulled paper-thin over a kitchen table, is a technique that arrived in Vienna from Hungary and ultimately from the Ottoman culinary tradition. The goulash that appears on menus across Austria is a Hungarian dish that migrated westward along the empire's internal trade routes. The Kaiserschmarrn, literally the emperor's mess, a torn pancake dusted with sugar, carries the dynasty's name in its very title. The cuisine of Central Europe is a cuisine of cultural fusion, and the empire was the crucible in which that fusion occurred. The political legacies are more ambiguous and more troubling. The Habsburg model of multi-ethnic governance, for all its historical interests, contained within it patterns that would be replicated in darker contexts throughout the 20th century. The empire's reliance on bureaucratic surveillance and censorship under Metternich established templates of state control that later, more malevolent regimes would refine. The system of ethnic categorization that the empire developed for administrative purposes, counting and classifying populations by language, religion, and nationality, created the conceptual framework within which ethnic cleansing and genocide would later be imagined. The Habsburgs did not intend these outcomes. They would have been horrified by them. But the tools they built for managing diversity could be and were repurposed for destroying it. The treatment of Jews within the Habsburg Empire illustrates this ambiguity with particular clarity. The Habsburgs' record on Jewish rights was, by the standards of European monarchies, relatively progressive. Joseph II's patent of toleration in 1781 extended significant civil rights to Jewish subjects for the first time. The liberal Constitution of 1867 granted Jews full legal equality, and in the decades that followed, Jewish communities across the empire flourished to an extraordinary degree. Jewish writers, scientists, musicians, lawyers, doctors, and entrepreneurs contributed disproportionately to the cultural and economic life of Vienna, Prague, Budapest, and a dozen other cities. The roster of world historical figures who emerged from the Jewish communities of the Habsburg lands is staggering. Freud, Kafka, Mahler, Wittgenstein, Herzl, von Neumann, Polanyi, Zweig, and the list could be extended almost indefinitely. But this flourishing occurred alongside a persistent and deepening current of anti-Semitism that the empire's institutions could contain but could not cure. The legal equality granted in 1867 did not eliminate social discrimination. The cultural prominence of Jewish intellectuals and professionals provoked resentment among populations who felt displaced or threatened by Jewish success. Karl Lueger's anti-Semitic populism in Vienna demonstrated that democratic politics could be weaponized against minority communities in ways that the old aristocratic order had not permitted. The empire's dissolution removed the institutional framework that had, however imperfectly, protected Jewish communities from the worst consequences of popular hostility. In the successor states, and above all in the territories that fell under Nazi control after 1938, the Jewish communities that the Habsburg Empire had nurtured were systematically annihilated. The Holocaust destroyed not just millions of individual lives, but an entire civilization, the Yiddish-speaking and German-speaking Jewish world of Central Europe, that had been one of the Habsburg Empire's most remarkable and most vulnerable creations. Vienna's Jewish population, which had numbered nearly 200,000 in 1938, roughly 10% of the city's total, was reduced to a few thousand by 1945. The coffee houses that had been incubators of Jewish intellectual life were emptied. The university faculties were purged. The concert halls and theaters that had thrived on Jewish patronage and Jewish talent fell silent, or continued under conditions that mocked their former vitality. The civilization that Stefan Zweig mourned in his memoir The World of Yesterday, the cosmopolitan, tolerant, culturally rich world of late Habsburg Central Europe, was not merely ended by the empire's dissolution. It was murdered, deliberately and comprehensively, by the forces that the empire's dissolution had unleashed. Zweig himself, who had been born in Vienna in 1881 and had known the empire in its final decades, spent his exile years writing about the world he had lost with a grief that was inseparable from his prose style. His description of pre-war Vienna, a city where every citizen was unconsciously trained to be international, cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world, captured something real about the Habsburg imperial capital, even as it idealized it. Zweig killed himself in Brazil in 1942, unable to bear the destruction of the civilization he loved. His suicide note spoke of the exhaustion of a man who had watched his world destroyed twice, first by the empire's dissolution, then by the genocide that followed. The geography of the former Habsburg lands became, in the 20th century, a geography of catastrophe. The empire's dissolution created the conditions. The rise of fascism and the Second World War provided the mechanisms. While the territories that had been governed, however imperfectly, by a dynasty committed to multi-ethnic coexistence became killing fields where ethnicity was the criterion for life or death. The Holocaust was the most systematic and the most devastating of these catastrophes, but it was not the only one. The ethnic cleansings that accompanied and followed the Second World War decade, the expulsion of millions of Germans from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary, the massacres of Serbs by Croats and of Croats by Serbs in wartime Yugoslavia, the destruction of Hungarian communities in Romania and Transylvania, were all in different ways consequences of the failure to find a viable alternative to the Habsburg model of multi-ethnic governance. The Cold War imposed a different kind of order on the former Habsburg lands, an order based not on dynastic loyalty or national self-determination, but on ideological alignment and military power. Austria, through a combination of luck, diplomacy, and geography, emerged as a neutral state, a status formalized by the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which ended the Allied occupation and committed Austria to permanent neutrality. The other successor states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, fell under Soviet domination or, in Yugoslavia's case, charted an independent but still authoritarian communist course. For 4 decades, the Iron Curtain bisected the former Habsburg Empire along a line that bore no relation to the empire's historical geography. Vienna, which had been the center of a vast multi-ethnic state, found itself on the western edge of the communist world, looking east across a fortified border towards cities, Prague, Budapest, Bratislava, that had been part of its own cultural and economic sphere within living memory. The connections that the empire had built over centuries, the trade routes, the rail lines, the family ties, the shared cultural references, were severed by a barrier of concrete, wire, and ideological hostility. And yet the memory of the empire persisted in ways that were sometimes conscious and sometimes not. In Hungary, the memory of Habsburg rule was ambivalent. The Habsburgs had suppressed Hungarian independence, but they had also provided a framework within which Hungarian culture had flourished, and Hungarian territory had been vastly larger than it was under the Trianon settlement. In Czechoslovakia, and the memory was more negative. The Habsburgs had been associated with German-speaking dominance and the suppression of Czech national identity. But even there, the physical infrastructure of the empire remained visible in every cobblestone street and Baroque church facade. In Croatia and Slovenia, the memory was bound up with the even more fraught relationship with Serbian dominance in Yugoslavia, and the Habsburg period was sometimes remembered, with a selectivity that would have amused the Habsburgs themselves, as a golden age of order and cultural refinement. The fall of communism in 1989 reopened the question that the Habsburg dissolution had left unresolved. What was Central Europe, and how should it be organized? The revolutions of that year, the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the opening of the Hungarian border, the fall of the Berlin Wall, were, in one sense, the completion of the process that had begun in 1918. They were the final assertion of national self-determination against an imperial system, this time the Soviet one that had suppressed it. But they also reopened the deeper question of how the diverse peoples of the region could share political and economic space without either domination or fragmentation. The answer that emerged, gradually and imperfectly, was European integration. The former Habsburg lands joined the European Union in successive waves: Austria in 1995, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Poland in 2004, Romania and Croatia later. The EU offered something that the Habsburg Empire had provided and the nation-states had not: a framework for economic cooperation, legal harmonization, and political consultation that allowed small nations to participate in a larger whole without surrendering their sovereignty entirely. The parallels between the Habsburg model and the EU model were noted by observers with varying degrees of approval and alarm. Otto von Habsburg, who had advocated for European integration throughout his long political career, saw the EU as the fulfillment of the empire's best impulses, freed from its worst practices. Critics saw it as a new form of imperial overreach, imposing uniform standards on diverse populations from a distant bureaucratic center, Brussels playing the role that Vienna had once played, with regulations replacing edicts and summits replacing imperial audiences. The comparison is imperfect, as all historical analogies are. The EU is a voluntary association of democratic states, not a dynastic empire held together by marriage and military force. Its legitimacy derives from treaties ratified by elected governments, not from the accidents of birth and inheritance that determined Habsburg succession. Its institutions, however bureaucratic, are subject to democratic accountability in ways that the Habsburg administration never was. The differences are real and consequential. But the structural similarity is also real. Both the Habsburg Empire and the European Union are attempts to solve the same problem: the problem of organizing political life in a region where linguistic, ethnic, and cultural diversity makes the nation-state model inherently unstable. Both rely on institutional complexity, legal harmonization, and supranational authority to manage tensions that would otherwise produce conflict. Both face resistance from nationalist movements that regard supranational governance as a threat to national identity and sovereignty. Both struggle with the question of how much diversity a common political framework can accommodate before it ceases to cohere. The Habsburg answer to that question was more than you might think, but less than the times demanded. The empire accommodated enormous diversity for an extraordinarily long time, but it could not ultimately accommodate the demand for democratic self-governance that the modern era brought with it. Its model of multi-ethnic coexistence was predicated on the acceptance of dynastic authority, on the willingness of diverse peoples to subordinate their national aspirations to a common allegiance to the crown. When that willingness evaporated, as it did in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the empire had nothing to replace it with. It could not offer its peoples democracy because democracy in a multi-ethnic state would inevitably become a vehicle for the majority nationality to dominate the minorities. It could not offer them national sovereignty because national sovereignty would dissolve the empire. It was trapped between two principles, both legitimate, both irreconcilable, and in the end the tension tore it apart. The EU faces a version of the same dilemma, though in a different form and at a different historical moment. The tension between national sovereignty and supranational governance, between democratic legitimacy and technocratic efficiency. Between the desire for common standards and the insistence on national distinctiveness, these are the Habsburg tensions reborn in democratic clothing. Whether the EU will resolve them more successfully than the Habsburgs did remains an open question, one that the crises of the early 21st century, the Eurozone crisis, the migration crisis, Brexit, the rise of populist nationalism, have made more urgent and less certain. The physical traces of the empire are still everywhere for those who know how to read them. The yellow paint on government buildings across Central Europe, the specific shade known as Schönbrunn yellow or Maria Theresa yellow, is a Habsburg legacy, a visual marker that once identified imperial property and that continues to color the administrative architecture of half a dozen modern nations. The double-headed eagle, the empire's ancient heraldic symbol, still appears on buildings, monuments, and institutional crests across the region. The rail stations, the post offices, the courthouses, the military barracks, the entire built environment of Central European governance bears the stamp of Habsburg administrative aesthetics, a style that valued solidity, symmetry, and a certain understated grandiosity that said, "The state is here. The state has always been here. The state will always be here." In the villages of the former empire, particularly in the countryside of Bohemia, Moravia, Galicia, and Transylvania, the Habsburg presence lingers in forms so mundane they are easy to overlook. The cadastral surveys that determine property boundaries in much of Central Europe were conducted under Habsburg authority. The parish registers that record births, marriages, and deaths, the primary source material for genealogical research across the region, were maintained according to standards established by Habsburg administrative decree. The postal system, the road network, the system of weights and measures, all of these bore, until quite recently, the imprint of the empire that had created them. To live in the former Habsburg lands is to inhabit, in ways both visible and invisible, a world that the dynasty built. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about the Habsburgs. Not that they ruled, but that they built. Not the palaces, though those endure. Not the monuments, though tourists photograph them by the millions. But the invisible architecture, the systems, the habits, the assumptions about how strangers might share a street, a city, a continent. These were the Habsburgs' truest constructions, and they have outlasted every stone the dynasty ever laid. The family itself continues. The House of Habsburg-Lorraine numbers several hundred living members scattered across Europe and the Americas, working as business people, diplomats, academics, and in one or two cases, race car drivers. They gather periodically for family events, weddings, funerals, the occasional commemorative ceremony at the imperial crypt. Karl von Habsburg, Otto's son and the current head of the family, holds a title that carries no political authority and governs no territory, but he maintains the family's institutional presence with a quiet diligence that his ancestors would have recognized as thoroughly Habsburg. He attends European Parliament sessions as an observer. He advocates for human rights and environmental causes. He represents in his person the continuation of a family story that began on a rocky promontory above the Ahr River 1,000 years ago. The Hawk's Castle still stands, or what remains of it. The ruin in the Swiss canton of Aargau is maintained now as a historical site visited by school groups and the occasional pilgrim curious enough to seek out the place where it all began. The walls are low, the tower is squat. The view over the valley is as broad and watchful as it was when Radbot built his fortress there, scanning the trade routes for opportunity, calculating the distances, waiting with the patience that would become his family's defining characteristic. If you stand there on a quiet afternoon, Aachen and the afternoons are almost always quiet because few tourists make the journey. You can see the landscape that made the Habsburgs, the rolling green hills, the dark pine forests, the river bending through its ancient course. It is a modest landscape, a landscape of patience rather than drama, of accumulation rather than conquest. Nothing about it whispers of empire. And yet empire came from here as improbably as an oak from an acorn, as inevitably as water flowing downhill toward the sea. The distance between this ruin and the Hofburg Palace in Vienna is roughly 600 kilometers. The distance between Radbot's ambitions and Charles V's empire is immeasurable, and yet the line connecting them is unbroken, a thread of dynastic continuity that stretches across 7 centuries without a single gap, a single interruption, a single moment when the family ceased to exist as a political force. Other dynasties rose higher in shorter periods. The Mongols conquered more territory in a single generation than the Habsburgs acquired in 10. Napoleon built an empire in 15 years that rivaled the Habsburgs at its height. But the Mongol Empire fragmented within decades of its founder's death. Napoleon's empire died with his exile. The Habsburgs endured. They endured through plague and reformation, through revolution and world war, through the rise of nationalism and the collapse of the old order. They endured because they understood in their bones a truth that more spectacular dynasties never grasped, that the longest game is the one played most quietly. Consider the mathematics of their persistence. The Habsburg line held power in Central Europe from 1273, when Rudolf was elected king of the Romans, to 1918, when Karl signed his renunciation in the blue Chinese salon of Schönbrunn. That is 645 years. To put that in perspective, 645 years before Rudolf's election, the Roman Empire in the West had not yet fallen. The entire history of the United States, from its founding to the present day, fits comfortably within the span of Habsburg rule, with room to spare. The dynasty witnessed the invention of the printing press, the discovery of the Americas, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of nationalism, and the advent of total war. It adapted to each of these transformations, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes clumsily, always stubbornly, and it survived them all, and until the last one finally proved too much. The question that historians continue to debate, and that the Habsburg story compels every thoughtful person to consider, is whether the empire's longevity was a sign of genuine strength or merely of the absence of a viable alternative. Did the Habsburg Empire endure because it worked, or because nothing better was available? Did its subjects remain loyal because they believed in the dynasty, or because they feared the chaos that would follow its dissolution? The honest answer is both. The empire worked after a fashion. It provided security against external threats of the Ottomans, Napoleon, the ambitions of neighboring powers. It provided a legal and administrative framework within which commerce could function, disputes could be adjudicated, and daily life could proceed with a reasonable degree of predictability. It provided a cultural space, imperfect, hierarchical, but real, within which diverse peoples could interact, create, and occasionally flourish. These were not trivial achievements. They were, for millions of people over hundreds of years, the conditions of ordinary life, and their absence, when the empire fell, was felt as keenly as any political transformation. But the empire also endured because its subjects understood, with a clarity born of geographic vulnerability, that the alternatives were worse. A Bohemia independent of the Habsburgs might fall under German domination. A Hungary independent of the Habsburgs might be swallowed by Russia or the Ottomans. A Croatia independent of the Habsburgs might be absorbed by Serbia or Italy. The empire was a shelter as well as a cage, and the peoples who lived within it knew the difference between imperfect protection and no protection at all. František Palacký's famous dictum, that if the empire did not exist, it would be necessary to invent it, was not an expression of love for the Habsburgs. It was an expression of fear about what would happen without them. That fear proved justified. The century that followed the empire's dissolution was, for the peoples of Central Europe, a century of catastrophe unmatched in their long history. 2 world wars, the Holocaust, communist dictatorship, ethnic cleansing, economic devastation, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia twice, once by Hitler in 1938, once by mutual agreement in 1993, the dissolution of Yugoslavia in blood and fire twice, first during the Second World War, then again in the 1990s, when the siege of Sarajevo returned that city to the world's attention for the first time since Gavrilo Princip's pistol shots had echoed through its streets 78 years earlier. The siege of Sarajevo, which lasted from 1992 to 1996, was in some terrible sense a coda to the Habsburg story. The The city where the empire's dissolution had begun became the city where the consequences of that dissolution reached their most extreme expression. Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Croats, and Bosnian Muslim were three communities that the Habsburg administration had governed within a single framework, however imperfectly, turned on each other with a savagery that the empire's existence had held in check. The snipers on the hills above Sarajevo, the mortar shells falling on the marketplace, and the detention camps and mass graves. These were not the products of ancient ethnic hatreds, as lazy Western commentators like to claim. They were the products of modern political failures that stretch back through decades of communist misgovernance and authoritarian nationalism to the original sin of the empire's dissolution. The naive belief that drawing national borders around ethnically mixed populations would produce peace rather than conflict. The Habsburg Empire had known better. Its rulers had understood through centuries of experience that Central Europe's populations were too intermingled, too economically interdependent, and too geographically entangled to be neatly sorted into nation-states. Every city of any significance contained multiple linguistic communities. Every province contained national minorities. Every attempt to draw a clean border along ethnic lines would leave millions of people on the wrong side. The empire's response governed them all together under a common sovereign authority that transcended national identity, was not elegant, not democratic, and not sustainable in the long run. But it was a response that took the region's complexity seriously, and the century that followed its abandonment demonstrated with overwhelming evidence the cost of ignoring that complexity. None of this means that the empire should have survived or that its survival was possible in the conditions of the early 20th century. The forces that destroyed it, nationalism, democracy, the demand for self-determination, were not malevolent forces. They were expressions of legitimate human aspirations that the empire's structures could not accommodate. People wanted to govern themselves in their own languages according to their own traditions. They wanted to participate in the decisions that shaped their lives. They wanted to be citizens, not subjects. These were reasonable desires, and the empire's inability to satisfy them was a genuine failure, not merely an unfortunate circumstance. The tragedy was not that the empire fell. The tragedy was that nothing adequate replaced it. The successor states inherited the empire's problems without inheriting its mechanisms for managing them. They were smaller, weaker, more vulnerable, and more homogeneous in aspiration but not in reality. The 3 million Germans in Czechoslovakia, the 3 million Hungarians in Romania, the Serb minorities in Croatia, and the Croat minorities in Serbia. These populations did not vanish when the empire did. They remained uneasily within states that defined themselves in national terms that excluded them, governed by majorities that viewed them with suspicion, surrounded by borders that separated them from their linguistic kin. The story of the 20th century in Central Europe is, in large part, the story of the violent resolution of tensions that the Habsburg Empire had managed without violence, not because the empire was just, but because it was comprehensive. It included everyone, however unequally. The nation-states that replaced it included some and excluded others, and the excluded paid a terrible price. This is the shadow that the Habsburg Empire casts across the modern world. And not the shadow of tyranny. So the Habsburgs were many things, but they were rarely tyrannical in the sense that the word carries today. Their rule was paternalistic, bureaucratic, sometimes oppressive, and frequently inefficient, but it was not murderous. The shadow they cast is the shadow of a question. Is there a form of political organization that can accommodate human diversity without either suppressing it or being destroyed by it? The Habsburgs answered that question for 6 centuries, imperfectly but persistently. Their answer was the dynasty. A single family sitting atop a structure of bewildering complexity, providing the one thing that all the empire's diverse peoples could share, a common sovereign whose authority derived not from ethnicity or language or culture, but from blood and law and time. It was an answer that belonged to an era when dynastic legitimacy was the dominant political principle of European civilization. When that principle was replaced by national self-determination, the answer ceased to function, and the empire ceased to exist. Whether a better answer will emerge, whether the European Union or some future form of political organization will find a way to accommodate diversity without dynasty, to provide the benefits of multi-ethnic cooperation without the costs of imperial authority, it seems, is the question that the former Habsburg lands and Europe as a whole continue to wrestle with. The answer is not yet clear. It may never be entirely clear. The problem the Habsburgs faced, how to hold together what history and geography have thrown together, is not the kind of problem that admits of a final solution. It is the kind of problem that must be managed day after day, generation after generation, with patience, with pragmatism, and with the understanding that perfection is not among the available options. The Habsburgs understood this. It was perhaps the deepest lesson they learned in their small stone castle above the Ahr, watching the river bend through its valley, counting the seasons, planting alliances that would not bear fruit for decades, that the work of governance is never finished. That stability is not a state of being, but a continuous act of will. That the empires which endure are not the ones that conquer most brilliantly, but the ones that adapt most patiently. The morning of June 28, 1914, was warm in Sarajevo. The Archduke wore his pale blue tunic, his wife wore her white dress. Their driver made a wrong turn. A 19-year-old boy raised a pistol, and 6 centuries of patient accumulation and the marriages, the treaties, the wars survived, the crises absorbed, the quiet, relentless building of a world began to dissolve. But here is the thing about dissolution. Sugar dissolved in water does not cease to exist. It becomes invisible. It changes the nature of the water itself. You cannot see it, but you can taste it. It is present in every drop. Walk through Vienna today. Sit in a coffee house on the Graben and order a melange, the Viennese coffee drink that is neither cappuccino nor café au lait, but something distinctly its own, a small act of cultural synthesis that no one thinks about anymore. Listen to the languages being spoken at the tables around you: German, Czech, Hungarian, Croatian, Turkish, Arabic, and English. A polyphony that the Habsburgs would have recognized instantly, even if the specific languages have shifted. Watch the tram glide past on tracks that were laid when Franz Joseph still sat at his desk at 3:30 in the morning, reading reports from an empire that no longer exists but whose infrastructure still carries the city's passengers to their destinations. Walk down to the Kapuziner Kirche. Descend the stairs into the crypt. Stand in the cool silence among the sarcophagi and the shadows and consider the fact that you are standing in the presence of a family that shaped the world you inhabit in ways you will never fully trace. The legal code that governs the contract you signed last week, the rail network that carried you to this city, the university system that educated you. The very concept of Central Europe as a coherent region with a shared history and a common set of problems, all of these are Habsburg legacies, invisible as dissolved sugar, present in every drop. The friar at the door asks his question, as he has asked it for centuries: who seeks entry? And the answer, stripped of every title, every territory, every century of accumulated power, is the same answer it has always been, the same answer it will always be: a mortal, sinful human being. The door opens. The silence closes, and the dynasty rests at last in the city it made, and the empire it dreamed and the world it left behind, a world that has forgotten the Habsburgs' names but still lives in ways it cannot see within the house they built.